I have told this story 100 times across 30 years, and every time I tell it, the listeners laugh in the same places and go quiet in the same places, and at the end they all say the same thing. I cannot believe a man that proud took so long. To which I always answer, you did not know Callum Errol. You did not know his father's house, or the long, cold corridors of Dunmore Castle, or the particular way a Highland winter teaches a boy that warmth is a thing you do not display. You did not know the set of his jaw when his grandmother called him down from the north, and the precise quality of his silence when she told him what she had done. You did not know any of that. So you cannot blame him for the months he spent being the most obstinate, the most armored, the most comprehensively wrong man I have ever had the pleasure of counting as my closest friend. What I can tell you is this: she was right. She was always right. And the one thing Callum Errol could never quite forgive his grandmother for was that she knew it before he did. My name is Aldrich Pemberton. I have been Callum's friend since we were boys sent north together to a tutor who believed in Latin before breakfast and silence after supper, who shared a cold dormitory for 4 years, and who developed, in consequence, the kind of friendship that is less an affection than a fact, something that exists without requiring explanation, the way the hills exist, or the cold. I know him better than any man alive. I know the difference between his silence when he is thinking and his silence when he is hiding. I know the 3 varieties of his jaw set, the one that means determination, the one that means displeasure, and the one that means he is frightened and will not say so. I know that he reads more poetry than he has ever admitted to anyone, that he keeps a box of his mother's letters in the bottom drawer of his desk at Dunmore, that he is kinder to his tenants than he allows anyone to see, and that once, at a supper in Edinburgh when we were perhaps 26, and the wine had been rather more plentiful than careful, he told me that the thing he was worst at in the world was beginning. Beginning anything. Any relationship, any conversation, any situation that required him to approach another person from a position of wanting something from them. Not because he was afraid of the want, exactly. Callum was not a man given to conventional fear. He was not afraid of hard work or difficult weather or financial complexity, or the particular kind of men who mistake their physical size for authority. But the act of wanting something from another person placed a portion of yourself in their hands, and the portion of Callum Errol that had learned not to be held was, by 34, very large indeed. So you cannot blame him, not entirely. I am the one who was standing in the drawing room at Dunmore Castle on the 3rd of October, in the year he turned 34, when the Dowager Duchess of Dunmore looked up from her embroidery frame and said, with the particular serenity of a woman who has considered every angle and found them all satisfactory, "I have engaged a companion, Callum. Her name is Miss Isadora Vane. She arrives on Thursday." The Duke of Dunmore put down his whiskey glass with a precision that was, in its way, more frightening than any outburst. Callum had a way of setting things down as if they were evidence in a case he was assembling, as if the quality of his displeasure could be read in the exactness of the movement, and it could, by anyone who knew how to read it. "You engaged a companion," he said. "I did. Without consulting me." "You were in Caithness," the Dowager said, not looking up. Her needle moved with calm, steady purpose. She was 71 years old, and she had managed the Dunmore estates, the Dunmore tenants, and one very difficult Dunmore Duke, her late husband, for 40 years. She had learned in those 40 years that the way to handle men with strong wills and deeply held positions was not to oppose the will directly, but to simply arrange matters so that the man arrived, by his own motion, at the place you had already prepared for him. She had been doing this for decades. She was very good at it. "I did not feel it necessary to send a letter north to ask your permission to hire a companion for my own household, dear." "This is my household." "It is your house," his grandmother said, and looked up then, and her eyes were precisely the same color as his, dark gray, steady, faintly amused, with the settled authority of someone who has been right about the important things too many times to be seriously troubled by minor disagreements. "There is a difference." Callum measured the battlefield, as he always did, with the speed and thoroughness of a man who has never entirely stopped thinking like a commander. He found no ground worth taking. He made the only intelligent decision available to him, which was to let it go. "Very well," he said. "A companion." He picked up his glass again, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man giving himself time to think. "What is she like?" "Sensible," said the Dowager. "Clever, well-read. Her French is excellent and her Latin is better than I expected from the application." She paused, and I know now, though I did not know then, that she was weighing exactly how much to say, with the precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime understanding that the right amount of information at the right moment is its own kind of architecture. Too much and the man would build his defenses. Too little and he would be unprepared. The Dowager operated with the accuracy of a surveyor. Her father was a gentleman until his circumstances reversed. She has been in reduced positions for 4 years. She is not precious about it. "How old?" 24. Callum turned to look at me. I was examining the fire with an attention it did not particularly merit, the fire being, in all honesty, doing nothing especially interesting. "Aldrich," he said. "Is there something you would like to tell me about my grandmother's new companion?" "I have never met the woman," I said. This was entirely true, and I was grateful for it. "Is there something you would like to tell me about my grandmother's intentions?" "I think," I said, choosing my words with the care of a man navigating a frozen loch where the thickness of the ice varies considerably, "that her grace has always had a gift for identifying useful arrangements." The silence that followed was the quality of silence that precedes summer thunderstorms. The air changes pressure, everything goes still, the birds stop. "She is a companion," his grandmother said, serene as a summer morning itself. "Nothing more. Drink your whiskey, Callum." He drank his whiskey. He said nothing further about it that evening. He sat with his glass and looked at the flames with the measured attention of a man organizing something behind his face. And then he went to his study. And then he went to bed. And neither of these movements told you a single thing about the interior, because Callum Errol could manage the surface of himself with a completeness that would have impressed a diplomat. But I had known him for 22 years, and I knew that somewhere behind the careful stillness, the machinery of his resistance had already begun to turn. The difficulty with Callum Errol, and I say this as his closest friend and therefore the person most qualified to speak to it, was not that he was unkind. He was not. He was, at his core, a person of considerable natural warmth, which is exactly why the armor over it was so extensive. Because natural warmth, in the household where he had grown up, had learned to protect itself by becoming invisible. His father had been a cold man, not cruel in the active sense, not violent, not vindictive, not the kind of cold that leaves bruises, but cold in the way that a January morning is cold. Complete, without exception, without the comfort of being aware that it owes you an apology for itself. The old Duke of Dunmore had married a woman he respected, and governed an estate he prized, and raised a son he valued for what that son might become. And he had done all of this without waste or sentiment, or what he would have called unnecessary warmth. The word unnecessary was the operative word. He had genuinely believed that warmth was a resource, like timber or capital, available in finite quantities, to be deployed carefully toward productive ends, and not to be spent on sentiment for its own sake. What this produced in the household was a particular quality of silence, not hostility, not unhappiness in the dramatic, visible sense, just the silence of rooms where people had long since stopped expecting to be reached. Callum's mother had been a gentle woman. She had a light laugh and a genuine love of growing things, and an interest in music that she had eventually, quietly stopped demonstrating, because the harpsichord in the music room, the harpsichord that the late Duke's mother had purchased, and that his grandmother before him had played, was not serviced after the old Duke made his feelings about evening music clear, in the way he made his feelings clear about all things, once with finality and not again. The instrument went under a dust cloth. The laugh went quieter. When she died, Callum was 19, at university in Edinburgh, and he came home for the funeral with the contained, careful expression of a man who is managing something very large very tightly. And he went back to university, and he did not, from his letters, cry in anyone's presence. He told me, on the train returning south, that he felt as if something had been removed from the household that he had not, until it was gone, understood to be structural. His father had lived another 10 years after that. He had died on a Tuesday, in bed, solvent and managed and admired in the professional sense, for the efficiency of his estates and the reliability of his views and the thoroughness of his arrangements. And there had been no one at the funeral weeping with the grief of having lost someone genuinely known. What Callum had inherited was, One castle, 4 estates, a great deal of money, a dukedom 3 centuries old, 1,200 tenants who feared and respected him. The obligation of a name and the deep, bone-level conviction, not thought, not decided, simply present like the hills or the cold, that a man of his position did not show his workings. He was not easy to love, he was not easy at all. But I will say this truly, he was worth loving for anyone with the patience and the perception to look past what he had built to what lived inside it. He was the most reliable man I have ever known, in the deep sense of reliable that does not require witnesses or occasions. He simply was what he said he was in all circumstances, without exception or performance. He was generous with his tenants in the practical, unglamorous, consistent way that means roofs are sound and children have schools, and the winter is not cruel for people who cannot afford the winter to be cruel. He had read more than he admitted. He had a dry, exact humor that appeared so rarely that when it did the effect was considerable, and the room was always slightly surprised. And when he chose to be tender, and he did, occasionally in private, with a handful of people he had decided were worth the risk of being real with, it was the full thing, the whole weight of it, given without display or performance, and it stayed with you. I had watched 3 women approach him across the 12 years since he'd inherited, all of them reasonable, all of them interested, all of them equipped with what ought to have been sufficient. All of them had eventually withdrawn, with the slightly bewildered air of someone who had prepared thoroughly for a conversation, and found the other person had no interest in having one. One had told me, at a supper party that spring, that talking to Callum Errol was like trying to start a fire in a stone room in January. I had not disagreed, but I had thought, you are starting the fire wrong. The Dowager had been watching all of this with the patient, purposeful attention of a woman who knows she is right, and who has learned, over 7 decades, that being right is only useful if you do something about it in time. She had been watching the young women fail, and she had been thinking, and she had been waiting for the right application, and in the late summer of that year she had found it. She had not looked for a woman who would charm him. A woman who tried to charm Callum Errol was working against the whole nature of the thing, because the nature of the thing was that he could identify charm from a distance. He was not immune to it. He simply had no use for it, the way a man who has decided to walk on his own 2 legs has no use for the offer of a chair. And a woman deploying it in his direction produced in him not the desired warmth, but a careful, polite, impenetrable remove. The answer was a woman who would not try to charm him and did not need to, who would not try to anything, in fact, who would simply be in the rooms and be entirely herself, without amendment or campaign, and let him discover her rather than being presented with her. A woman who was not reaching for him, who was not performing, who was not hoping or managing, who was simply present in whatever space she occupied with the full, settled, self-sufficient authority of someone who has decided, through experience rather than convention, that their own company is adequate, and that any additions to it, however welcome, are additions rather than necessities. A woman, in other words, whom he could not manage by maintaining distance, because she was not at the distance at all. She was simply there, and the distance was his problem. She had been reviewing companion applications for months before she wrote to Isadora Vane. She showed me the original letter once, some years later, over tea on a November afternoon when the topic had come around naturally. It was in a clear, exact hand, not beautiful in the ornamental sense, but precise and characterful, with the quality of someone who has been careful about words long enough that the care has become natural. It said, I am 24 years of age, the daughter of a gentleman, educated to a level exceeding my current position, fluent in French and working in Italian, with a reading knowledge of Latin maintained through private study. I have been 4 years in companion or governess positions, with references available on request. I am accustomed to adaptability and not given to complaint. I would describe my company as stimulating to those who desire stimulation and undemanding to those who do not. I read aloud well. I have a practical nature and a genuine preference for being genuinely useful over being merely present. I am without connections and without means, and I would consider a position in the Scottish borders desirable precisely because it is at some distance from the circles that knew my father, which I find, in reduced circumstances, easier than the alternative. The Dowager had read this letter 3 times. She had noted in the margin in her small, neat hand, her. Miss Isadora Vane arrived on Thursday, as promised. I was in the library when the carriage came up the drive. The library is on the first floor and looks out over the east approach, a long gravel drive between old lime trees that are magnificent in summer and skeletal and dignified in October. And the day was the kind of October day that Dunmore specializes in. The sky pewter, the air cold and particular, the trees beginning to let go of their leaves in the unhurried way that the trees at Dunmore always did, as if the matter had been decided long ago and there was no reason for drama. The young woman who stepped out of the carriage was not what I had expected. I had expected something faded. A woman 4 years in reduced circumstances. I had formed the picture of someone who had been dignified under pressure for long enough that the pressure was beginning to show, the particular worn quality of maintained composure. She was not faded. She was not beautiful in the deliberate, cultivated way the Edinburgh drawing rooms rewarded, not fair, not fine-boned, not arranged into the careful softness the season approved. She was dark-haired and tall, taller than you expected, with the straightness of someone who has decided some time ago to occupy their full height or be elsewhere. Her dress was carefully turned and plain, the dress of someone who understands their financial reality and is not pretending otherwise, maintained with the same practical pride she brought to everything she maintained. Her face, when she looked up at Dunmore Castle for the first time, was the face of a woman making an accurate assessment. She did not look intimidated. She did not look anxious. She looked like someone taking honest measure of the ground they had just been given and deciding from the evidence what it would require of them. Then she gave her bag to the footman, said something brief to him that made him blink and then smile. I could not hear it from the window, but the smile was genuine and slightly startled, the smile of someone who has been surprised into it, and walked toward the front door with the steady, unhurried step of someone who has decided to occupy whatever ground they are given with full dignity, or not to occupy it at all. I liked her before she had crossed the threshold. An hour later, the Dowager introduced us in the Rose sitting room over tea. She was composed with the composure of someone who has earned it, and there was warmth underneath, visible in the way she listened, a slight forward inclination, the quality of actually being there when someone spoke, and in the brief, bright smile that appeared unexpectedly and then withdrew, and in the way she answered questions with exactly the right detail, enough to be informative, not enough to perform. When I asked what had brought her specifically to apply for a position in the Scottish borders, she looked at me with the level, measuring look that I was going to come to recognize as her standard response to questions she was deciding how much to answer. "Good references and a pragmatic nature, Mr. Pemberton," she said. "And the borders specifically. I find the South too full of people who remember my father's debts," she said, and then the brief smile, a bird, lighting and gone, and I understood that the steadiness was not the whole picture, that beneath it was something warmer and more specific and considerably more alive than the general surface suggested. "Dunmore is very far from any of that," I said. "So I hoped," she said. The Dowager watched all of this with the gentle, unfocused attention of a woman thinking about her embroidery, which meant she was watching with considerable sharpness and not missing a syllable. Callum was out on the estate that day. He was managing the drainage of the lower fields, which had been his project for the autumn, which he attacked, as he attacked all projects, with the thorough, systematic intelligence of a man who finds in the solving of practical problems a kind of cleanness that the management of human situations rarely provides. He was a gifted landlord, and he knew it and the estate showed it and the tenants knew it, which is the way the knowledge matters. He did not come in until supper, arriving at the table with the distracted, purposeful air of a man whose mind is still on a culvert. He sat down. He assessed the table arrangement, the Dowager at the head, myself at her right, and Miss Vane to the Dowager's left. With the swift, controlled glance he gave all situations he was entering for the first time and wished to understand before he committed to anything. "Miss Vane," he said, "you arrived safely." "I did, Your Grace, thank you." "Was the road poor? I understand there has been mud." "Manageable. The post roads are better maintained than I expected this far north. We had them resurfaced in the summer." He said this with the matter-of-fact quality of a man stating a true thing and looked at his plate. It was not, as opening exchanges go, a great deal to work with. But I watched his eyes go to her once, and once more with the sideways attention of a man who is conducting an assessment he does not intend to be visible, She is younger than I thought. She is not precisely what I was bracing for. There is something here that is not what I was expecting, and the assessment went on slightly longer than he had planned. She ate her soup and spoke to the Dowager about the household schedule for the following week, and said nothing to the Duke beyond what was directly asked, and none of what she said reached for anything. After supper, the Dowager asked me to read aloud, as she sometimes did on evenings when she was in the mood for literature rather than cards. I produced the novel in fashion that season, a sensational thing, popular, with more incident than probability, and read 3 chapters while the Dowager sat with her eyes pleasantly half-closed, and Miss Vane did her sewing near the window, and Callum occupied the chair by the fire with a book he was intermittently turning the pages of, in a rhythm that suggested the form of reading rather than the substance. When I finished the 3rd chapter and looked up to see whether the Dowager wished me to continue, Miss Vane said, without looking up from her needle, "I think the author is wrong about the cousin's motive." She had addressed this to the room generally, in the manner of someone making an observation that the room could take or leave. "Wrong how?" I said. "The cousin acts from jealousy in Chapter 6, but the author has given him none of the earlier behavior that jealousy produces, the small cruelties, the comparisons, the deflections. None of it is there. If you trace the scenes back to where the author is actually paying attention, the cousin is behaving like a grieving man. The author has written grief and labeled it jealousy. These are different things with different consequences, and the confusion will cause problems later in the novel." A pause in which the room absorbed this. "That is quite a specific observation," Callum said from his chair by the fire. "It is a specific flaw," Miss Vane said, and glanced at him, and went back to her needle with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to all things. He said nothing else that evening. But when I went to bed that night, I was smiling. The first 3 weeks of October passed in the pattern of a household establishing itself. The Dowager had been lonely. She would not have said so, being not a woman given to that kind of admission. But there was a quality of silence about Dunmore Castle that I had been aware of for years. The silence of a house where the register of conversation has been narrowed by long habit to what is practical and functional and safe. The Duke was a man of business, of purpose, of the estate and the management of it. Excellent company in the specific register of things to be done, and essentially absent in the register of things to be felt or laughed about or argued through. Miss Vane was present in that register entirely. She settled into the Dowager's days with a brisk, warm competence, managing the correspondence and the household appointments and the reading aloud and the walks in the East Garden. And the competence was also kindness, which is rarer than either alone. She had a gift for the kind of attention the Dowager actually needed, which was not coddling and not flattery but genuine engagement. Listening to the opinions and engaging with them, disagreeing when she disagreed, challenging what she thought was wrong, in the specific, respectful way that one intelligent person engages with another when they take them seriously. They argued about novels. They argued about French poetry. They had a long, mutually invigorating disagreement about Gothic literature that ended in what I could only describe as an honorable draw, which was new in the Dowager's experience, and which she found, evidently, enormously refreshing. They spoke French when the topic demanded it, and did not always trouble to include me, which was occasionally irritating and frequently instructive about the velocity of a dispute between 2 people who are both fast and both committed, and who have decided, mutually and without saying so, that the other is worth the full expenditure. Callum watched this from a slight distance. He maintained, across these first weeks, a quality of considered remove. He was present at suppers and at the occasional evening in the drawing-room, and he was not conspicuously avoiding anything. He was too disciplined for that, and too honest. Avoidance, to his mind, had the quality of something owed, but the particular intensity of engagement I sometimes saw in him when a subject interested him, the quality of full attention, was not directed toward Miss Vane. Or so it appeared. I knew him, and I knew the difference between a man reading and a man holding a book. The first time I caught it clearly was a Wednesday evening in the 2nd week. The Dowager and Miss Vane were deep in the Racine dispute, whether the resolution at the end of the 4th act was genuine or performative, and she was arguing with the slight gestural emphasis she used when she felt the force of what she was saying. A small, decisive movement of the hand as if placing the argument on the table, and there was a brightness to her in that moment that was not usually visible in the ordinary light of things. the brightness of someone doing something that agrees with their full self, lit from inside. And I looked across the room and found Callum not reading. He was watching her argue with the expression of a man who has just heard, in a room he thought he knew, a piece of music that he recognized without having heard it before. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he noticed I was watching and the expression closed like a shutter, and he went back to his book, and I went back to what I had been doing, and neither of us said a word. But I thought, there it is. He would not have agreed with me. He had a considerable investment in not agreeing with me, because agreeing would have required him to acknowledge what the awareness was and what it meant, and he was not ready for that in October. He was ready in October to decide that the awareness was a manageable inconvenience and to apply his considerable organizational intelligence to keeping it in its box. This strategy was not going to work. I knew it, and the Dowager knew it, and the universe knew it, and he alone did not know it yet. The incident with the harpsichord happened on a Friday night in late October. The Dowager had gone to bed early with a cold. I had gone up an hour after her, tired from a day of riding the estate with Callum to inspect the fence lines of the eastern pasture. I woke at something past midnight to a sound half heard through the thick stone walls of the castle, so out of place that it pulled me upright. Music. Someone was playing the harpsichord in the music room at the far end of the east wing. The harpsichord had not been properly played in 15 years. The late Duke's instruction, once with finality not repeated, had been sufficient to close it. The instrument sat under a dust cloth in the music room, the action uncertain, the strings unattended, like a room no one had the authorization to enter. I put on my dressing gown and followed the sound. The music room door was ajar. A single candle burned on the instrument. Miss Vane sat at the keyboard with her back to the door, playing with the complete, unself-conscious concentration of someone who believes they are entirely alone. What she played was not formal, not a composed piece with a title, but the improvisatory kind of music a musician makes when thinking or feeling rather than presenting. Slow and harmonically unusual and entirely of a piece with the hour and the cold and the single flame. The harpsichord's voice was uneven, 2 or 3 strings bad, producing a buzzing where there should have been clarity, and she moved around the imperfections with the ease of someone who knows an instrument well enough to work within its failures. There was something in the playing that was like her in conversation, direct, going where it needed to go, without ornament for its own sake. I stood in the doorway and listened until the piece came naturally to rest, not stopping, just arriving, the way improvised music arrives somewhere when the thought that drove it has found its place. "You'll wake the household," I said quietly. She turned at once, not startled, simply identifying the sound. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, "I'm sorry." I couldn't sleep. "Nor could I," said, pulling a chair to the hearth where the embers still held some warmth. "Do you play often?" "I used to before." She looked at the keys with the look you give the memory of something, close enough to see but not so close as to be inside it. "There was a pianoforte in the house in Warwickshire. My father bought it for me when I was 8. I took lessons until I was 16 and taught myself after that." She did not say more about the house in Warwickshire. The house in Warwickshire was the house the debts had taken, and the instrument in the house was not recoverable, and there was no instrument in a companion's room in Edinburgh. "This instrument is in a poor state," I said. "It is," she played a chord 2 notes clear, too buzzing with neglect. "But it is there. Some instruments are better than none." She looked at me across the candle, and in the candlelight her face was more readable than in the daytime, the composure softer without being absent. "I didn't think anyone would hear. The walls are very thick." "They are. I happen to be awake." She nodded, then, "Is there a tuner available, or does the Duke prefer the instrument as furniture?" I laughed. I could not help it. The question was so precisely, practically her. "I shall make inquiries," I said. We sat for a little while in the warm room, she with her hands in her lap and I with my hands on my knees, and we talked about this and that, about the Dowager's cold, about the state of the estate gardens in October, about whether the novel I had been reading aloud had sufficient probability in its 2nd volume to sustain the first. And it was the kind of conversation that requires nothing of either person beyond the being in it, which is the best kind. When I went back to bed, I lay in the dark, thinking about the harpsichord in the house in Warwickshire, and the particular quality of her face when she said before, and whether the music room at Dunmore might, in some quiet way, be recovering itself. In the morning, I mentioned to Callum, as casually as I could manage, that the music room harpsichord might benefit from attention. He gave me a look of mild suspicion. Why? It hasn't been tuned in years. No one plays it. Miss Vane plays, I said. She was at it last night when I couldn't sleep. She's quite good. The look shifted. Not much, the degree a compass needle moves when you bring a magnet near, and then it settled back. Does she? He said. It was not quite a question. Apparently, you hadn't known. My grandmother said nothing about it. No, I said, she didn't. He said nothing more about the harpsichord that day. But 3 days later, a tuner arrived from Edinburgh and spent the full day on the instrument. A day's work that told me something about the degree of neglect, and something else about the degree of attention being given to putting it right. And when I told Miss Vane the following morning that the instrument had been seen too, and that she was welcome to use the music room at any reasonable hour, she looked at me with the brief, measuring look of someone who has understood something they are not going to say directly, and said, "Please thank whoever arranged it." I passed this to Callum without editorial comment. He received it without editorial response. He said in the way that closes a subject. But the expression that preceded the closing, the half-second before the shutter, had a quality I had not seen before. The expression of someone who has done a private thing and been noticed doing it, and who is not certain what to do with the being noticed. That evening he lingered after supper. He was not a lingering man, he had things to do. He went and did them, but he stayed. And when Miss Vane settled at the harpsichord and played something clear and well-built that turned, in its middle section, into something more personal and harmonically unusual, I watched the Duke sit in his chair and not pick up his book at all. She played for 30 minutes. When she stopped and looked across the room with the small, questioning look of someone checking whether they have been welcome, he said, without particular inflection, "You may continue if you like." She played until 10:30. I said nothing. I was very carefully not saying anything. I was, in fact, not saying anything with such completeness that it was beginning to require effort. November brought the definitive shift from unconscious awareness to active management. He was methodical, Callum Errol. This is one of his most consistent and useful qualities, and is, in this particular situation, the thing that made the whole business take as long as it did. Because the same thoroughness with which he managed his estates and his correspondence and his tenants he also applied to managing his own inconvenient feelings. And the result was a process that was, from the outside, at once admirable and exasperating. He began to be absent from supper once or twice a week. The excuses were always plausible and usually half-true. He was a conscientious landlord, and the autumn was full. But on these evenings, he was not in his study either. And once I passed the stable yard at dusk and found him there in conversation with the head groom about nothing in particular, standing in the cold at an hour when a man with a warm house and a waiting supper would normally be at table. With the slightly too deliberate quality of someone choosing their location, rather than arriving at it naturally. He was hiding from his own dining room, from his own drawing room, from the room where the thing that had become inconvenient was located, being entirely and unavoidably herself with his grandmother, and with me, and with the household, while he stood in the stable yard discussing fence posts with the groom in the November dark. And still she was not trying to reach him. That was the thing, the whole of the thing. She was not aware, as far as I could see, and I watched carefully, that there was anything to reach. She was in the house, doing her work, occupying her days with the settled, complete self-possession she had brought through the castle door that October Thursday. She was not watching for signs of his notice. She was not adjusting her behavior in any direction whatsoever. She was being herself with the complete, uncontrived naturalness of someone who has discovered, through 4 years of positions in which nothing was guaranteed and nothing owed, that the only reliable thing is to be precisely and consistently who you are, because everything else can be taken. This is what the Dowager had seen. In mid-November, I walked with her on the river path on a gray morning, because the Dowager's cold had returned and she was keeping her rooms, and Callum was at the northern farms. The river was fast and gray and full of autumn rain, and we walked in the comfortable silence of two people who have discovered they do not need to fill the air. After a time, she said, without particular preamble, looking at the river, "My father was a very good man who made very bad decisions. I have spent 4 years deciding which part of that to inherit. Which have you decided on? I said. The goodness, she said. The decisions were his, not mine. They were not available to me at the time, and they are not available to me now, and I see no reason to carry them further than I have to. That is not a simple thing to arrive at. No, she said, it isn't. She picked up a stone, looked at it briefly, set it down with the automatic gesture of someone who once picked up stones as a habit and finds the habit persisting. He borrowed against the house in good faith. The man he borrowed from was not in good faith. By the time it was clear, nothing was recoverable. He died 8 months before the final judgment, which I have sometimes thought was the only piece of luck in the whole business. She said all of this with the flatness of a story from which the self-pity has been burned away over time, leaving only the facts. I was 20. My mother had died when I was 14. There was no one. And so, I said. And so, she said, I did what needed doing and I am still doing it, and on the whole it is a reasonable life. A pause. I tell you this because I think you will wonder about it eventually, and I would rather you heard it without amendment. You are very direct, I said. I find it saves time, she said, and the brief smile. We turned at the river bend. Coming back up through the east garden, Callum was there. He was coming from the direction of the home farm, his coat dark with the wet air, with the particular half-distracted look of a man who has been working through a problem and has not quite finished. He stopped at the sight of us, the smallest, barely visible hesitation of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect anyone to be and is recalibrating, and looked from me to Miss Vane with a quick assessment, and then fell into step with us because there was nothing else to do without making the decision conspicuous. Your Grace, she said, how are the northern farms? The drainage is holding. He glanced at her briefly and then away. You've been walking. Mr. Pemberton needed air. The path at the second oak can be wet after rain, he said. It was the kind of information he gave to his tenants when they were going out in uncertain weather, practical, direct, without decoration. It was, she said, we managed. He walked with us back to the castle, and they exchanged perhaps 4 more sentences, all of them of the same practical, informational quality, and I watched his eyes go to her once, sideways, with the held attention of a man who is doing something he does not intend to be visible. She was looking ahead at the path. We came in, he went to change his coat, I caught her in the hall. May I ask you something? She turned with the willingness she gave to direct questions. Do you find Dunmore isolating? She considered it genuinely. Not as much as I expected, it is very substantial, the castle, the estate, the whole shape of the place. She looked at the old stone of the entrance hall, the portraits, the particular weight of a house that has held the same family for 3 centuries and knows it. There is something to be said for substance. A pause. The Duke is not easy company. He is not, I agreed. But he is honest, completely, sometimes inconveniently honest. He says exactly what he means, even when what he means is discouraging. I have met a great many men who were easier and dishonest, and the trade is not one I recommend. She looked at me with the level directness she gave to things she wanted received clearly. He says what he means. There is a great deal to be said for that. She went upstairs. I stood in the entrance hall for a moment, thinking that Callum Errol had absolutely no idea what sort of person was living in his house, and that this was very possibly about to become his most significant problem. It was 3 days after the river walk that he found out she could ride. This was not planned by anyone I can prove, though I would not put it past the Dowager, who had a talent for creating the conditions in which encounters occurred without appearing to have engineered them. What happened was that Callum was going to the far pasture to look at the drainage culvert with his estate manager, and had asked the groom to ready his horse and the gray for me, as he sometimes did when the day's work suited 2 riders. When we came to the stable yard at 8 in the morning, there was Miss Vane, in a plain habit that was old but well-maintained with the same careful pride she brought to all her maintained things, talking to the head groom about the grays near foreleg. Callum stopped. Miss Vane. Your Grace, she met his look with the level composure she brought to all situations, unforced and unqualified. He's been off that foreleg since at least Wednesday. I noticed it when Mr. Pemberton was exercising him last week. The groom's been watching it. She addressed this to Callum with the matter-of-fact directness of someone delivering information to the person for whom it is relevant, and offering it without any particular investment in its reception. Callum looked at the head groom. "She's right, Your Grace," the groom said, with the carefully expressed manner of someone navigating a situation they have not encountered before. "Not lame, just careful. I've been meaning to mention it." Callum looked back at Miss Vane. She met his look. "Can you keep up?" he said. It was a test. Not unkind, but testing, the automatic habit of a man who establishes terms before committing to anything, who needs to know what he is dealing with before he deals with it. It was also, though I do not think he was fully aware of this, a small gift. If she could keep up, she was coming, and the estate manager would be there, and the culvert would be the subject, and there would be a reason for them to be in the same piece of country for a morning. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't ridden your country. If I fall behind, I'll find my way back." He nodded and went to his horse. She rode well, better than well. She rode with the complete economy of someone who learned young and has not lost it. No performance, no self-display, no looking to see whether the display was registering. She found her line on difficult ground without instruction, adjusted to the terrain with the quiet attentiveness of someone thinking about the horse and the ground rather than about anything else, and sat with the ease of someone for whom the horse is not an occasion but a means. At the culvert, the estate manager explained the situation in some detail, and she listened without offering an opinion, and when the explanation concluded, she said, "If the eastern wall above is also breached, the repair here is temporary. The water will find another path." Callum turned to her. "The wall above the second field," she said. "At the base, there is a crack that has had water in it. You can see where the moss is different. I noticed it walking on Thursday." She met his look without apology. "I notice things. I thought it might be relevant." He looked at the estate manager. "I'll check, Your Grace." He checked. She was right. The wall had a significant breach 3 feet up from the base, and the repair at the culvert without addressing the wall would have shifted the water problem rather than solving it. On the ride home, Callum said to me, low enough that she could not hear, she had dropped back at a narrow gate, giving room. "Where did she come from?" "Warwickshire," I said, "originally." "That is not what I mean." "I know," I said. "She is quite something, isn't she?" He said nothing to this. He said nothing to this in the deliberate way. He said nothing to things he had decided not to respond to, which is itself a kind of response if you know how to read it. I read it. When we came back to the stable yard and he dismounted, he held her horse's head while she swung down. It was a small, automatic courtesy that he did not, as a habit, perform for people. He was not a man for small courtesies without intention behind them. And she looked at him when she landed with the clear, honest look of someone recording information accurately. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He gave a single nod and walked away. The groom looked at the sky. I looked at the groom. We maintained a dignified silence, both of us. The last week of November brought the linen storage incident, which I mention because it is characteristic of her, and because Callum heard about it and his response was characteristic of him. She had apparently discovered, in the way she discovered things, by direct inquiry, by looking carefully at whatever she was looking at, by having the kind of attention that does not slide past the surface of things, that the linen storage had not been reorganized since the previous Duchess's time, which was Callum's mother's time, which was 15 years ago, and that in the interim the system of organization that the previous Duchess had established had gradually degraded in the way that systems degrade when the person who understood them is no longer present to maintain them, until the finding of tablecloths had become an unpredictable event, and the finding of matching sets a kind of optimism. She spent 3 mornings in November helping the housekeeper reorganize it. She did not ask permission. She simply did it. The housekeeper told me about it with the expression of someone for whom a genuine problem has been quietly, completely solved and expressed in the telling, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was the combination of the two, the feeling of having been seen to clearly without fanfare. Callum heard about it from the housekeeper. He said nothing to me about it, and nothing to Miss Vane, as far as I could tell. He was not a man for commentary on what he considered the proper functioning of a household, but I noticed him notice it, and file it with the small, accumulating weight of evidence he was building without quite meaning to. The harpsichord evenings continued through November. She played regularly now, in the evenings after supper, when the formal hours were done. She played for the Dowager when the Dowager wanted music, and she played for herself when the room was quiet, and she played with the quality that the better condition of the instrument made audible. A facility and a warmth that was, I thought, the most directly personal thing she had shown anyone in the household, the thing most clearly her own. Her playing was not the playing of someone who had been taught what to play. It was the playing of someone who had learned enough to say something with the instrument, and who had things to say. On the evenings she played, Callum did not pretend to read. He sat in his chair with his hands still on the arms, and he listened, with the full, unmanaged attention of a man who is not managing his attention because he has forgotten, for these 30 minutes, that he was supposed to be. When she finished, and he said, "You may continue if you like," or simply sat in the comfortable silence that followed, and she sometimes played again and sometimes didn't, and the evenings had a quality that was different from the evenings before October. The Dowager sat with her embroidery and her slight, contented smile and said nothing at all. The early December announcement of Edinburgh was, I understood now in the way I understood all of the Dowager's announcements, not an impulse but a plan. She had chosen her moment with the precision she brought to all choices, late enough in the autumn that the household was settled, and the rhythms were established, and the particular slow, unannounced work of proximity had done what it could do at Dunmore, and early enough in the Edinburgh season that the season itself, its suppers and assemblies and drawing rooms and the particular social density of a winter city, could do the rest. She announced it over supper, as if the thought had just arrived, and Callum received it as I have described, and 4 days later arrangements were underway. We went to Edinburgh in the 3rd week of November. The house on Charlotte Square was the Dunmore Townhouse, a good-sized Georgian terrace in the best part of Charlotte Square, with the Dowager's particular talent for making rooms comfortable in the specific, well-chosen way that is not showy and is not stingy, but is simply right. The drawing room had good chairs and adequate light, and a fire that was warm without being theatrical. The library was the sort of library that contains books that are actually read rather than books that have been selected for appearance, and Callum went straight to it on arrival and was not seen for 2 hours, which was usual. The music room had a pianoforte in substantially better condition than the Dunmore harpsichord, an instrument of real quality, with a warmth of tone and a responsiveness of action that the harpsichord, even serviced, could not match. Miss Vane saw it and looked at it with the look you give a thing you recognize and are glad to find. She did not play it immediately. She spent the first days establishing herself in the Edinburgh house as she had established herself at Dunmore, quietly, completely, without announcement, by simply doing what needed doing and doing it well. The Edinburgh house required different things than Dunmore, more attention to the social calendar, more management of the correspondence that the season required, more preparation for the receiving and visiting that Edinburgh demanded. She attended to all of it with the same brisk, unhurried competence she attended to everything. And then in the evenings she played. The first evening she played on the pianoforte in Charlotte Square, the difference the instrument made was immediately audible. The harpsichord had limited her. She had worked within its limitations with ease, but they were still limitations. And on this instrument she could do the full thing, and the full thing was considerable. She played a piece in 3 movements, the first 2 clear and formally well built, the third departing from the formal into something that was more entirely hers. Callum did not pretend to read. He sat in the chair by the fire and listened with his full attention, his long hands still on the arms of the chair, and when she finished he said, "Play it again." She turned to look at him. He held the look, which for him was as close to asking as he came. "If you would," he added, in a tone that was not quite apology but was the vicinity of one. She played it again. He was better, I think, at receiving music than at most other forms of experience that required him to be in the presence of something and be moved by it. Music did not look at you while it moved you, and you were not required to respond to it in any particular way, and the moving could occur in private while the rest of you sat perfectly still in an armchair. It was the ideal medium for a man who was trying not to be caught feeling things. But I was watching him. I was, I confess, watching him a great deal during that Edinburgh season, with the focused interest of a naturalist who has been waiting a long time for a particular event, and is not going to miss it now that it is beginning. Edinburgh received us as it always received us, with the particular bright, cold, social energy of a northern city that has decided the winter dark, is no argument against company, and in fact an argument for more fire and more candles, and more of the dense, lamplit companionship that open months do not require. The Dowager exercised her Edinburgh connections with the selective precision she brought to all things. The people she received were worth receiving, the people she visited were worth visiting, and the evenings she accepted were the evenings where the conversation would be good, and the company interesting rather than merely present. Miss Vane went with her to all of it. She moved through Edinburgh's winter drawing rooms with the ease of someone who has been in good company before and remembers how, even if the means had been absent for some years. She was not fashionable. She did not have the means to be fashionable, and she would not, I think, have spent the means on fashion if she had had them. But she had something better and rarer than fashion, which was the quality of being genuinely present to whoever was in the room. People noticed this, the way you notice a good fire when you come in from the cold. Not with the dramatic noticing of surprise, but with the slower, warmer recognition of something that was already working before you were aware of it. The Merivale supper was in the 3rd week of December. I introduced her to the retired professor of ancient history, the greatest bore in Edinburgh, a distinction he wore with some pride, and she spent 40 minutes talking to him about Roman agricultural drainage and the reliability of columella, and whether the latifundium as described in the treatises bore any relation to the latifundium as it actually existed. And at the end of the 40 minutes, he told me with complete sincerity that she was among the most intelligent people he had met in 30 years of Edinburgh dinners, which was genuinely saying something, since he had met a great number of people in 30 years. I mentioned this to Callum, who was nearby, and watched something move in his face, the recalculation of a man who has been accounting for something at an inaccurate figure and has just discovered the real number. He had known she was sharp. He had thought about her sharpness with the careful, managed awareness of someone putting something in a box and keeping the lid on. Brilliant was a different category, and the category shift was visible, and it was followed almost immediately by something that I recognized, which was the beginning of the particular quality of discomfort a man feels when he observes that other people have noticed something he considers his. He did not like the professor talking to her for 40 minutes. He would not have said this. He would have denied it under oath. But the quality of his stillness across the room, during those 40 minutes, was the stillness of a man being very careful not to look toward a particular part of the room with too much frequency. He liked it less when Sir Rupert Langley spent 20 minutes at a drinks gathering, asking her about Warwickshire with the focused interest of someone who has decided the woman he is talking to is worth the full deployment of his attention. Sir Rupert was agreeable and well off, and exactly the sort of man you would describe as eligible without difficulty, and he sat beside her at supper the following week and was thoroughly charming, and I watched Callum from across the table being thoroughly courteous to the woman on his left, and not watching Sir Rupert at all. He liked it considerably less than either of these when, at the Assembly Rooms in the 4th week of December, she danced twice with James Strathmore. Strathmore was a young advocate who had been at Edinburgh longer than the season, a serious, energetic man of perhaps 28, good-looking in an open way that was genuinely pleasant rather than studied, and at least as clever as she was, possibly more so in the specific register of legal argument, which was his register. He had been in Edinburgh society for 3 years, and was generally liked, and was making his way with the kind of purposeful, upward competence that suggests someone who knows what they want, and is acquiring it by legitimate means. He danced the first with her, and came back with the pleased, slightly energized expression of someone who has had a good conversation over a piece of music, which is what dancing is when it is working properly. He danced the second with the same energy, and he made her laugh. I was near enough to see it, a laugh I had heard only once before at Dunmore, when the head groom had said something dry about the weather. A real laugh, unguarded, the full thing, brief and clear. She came back to our party from the second dance, flushed with the movement and briefly, entirely, uncontrived bright. I watched Callum's face. He was, in the moment she came back from the dance, looking at her. Not with the sideways, managed attention of a man conducting an assessment he does not intend to be visible. Looking because he had forgotten, for a moment, to look away. And on his face was the expression of a man watching something he wants and observing that someone else is also in proximity to it, and the expression was entirely unguarded, and it was on his face for perhaps 4 seconds before he caught it. He caught it and it closed, and he was perfectly composed, and for the rest of the evening he was perfectly courteous to everyone present, including James Strathmore, who left at 10:30 in a good humor. But I had seen the 4 seconds, and I knew what they meant. We were very nearly there. The Strathmore matter came properly to a head in the first week of January. James Strathmore had found occasion, across the December gatherings, to call twice at Charlotte Square. He was paying attention to Miss Vane in a way that was entirely correct, open, appropriate, without presumption. And he was, as I have said, genuinely agreeable and genuinely clever, and there was nothing objectionable about his calling or his attentions, and nothing, under any ordinary assessment, that required anyone to object to them. It was the 3rd of January, and the Dowager had held a small afternoon reception, 8 or 10 people, the comfortable, interesting kind she preferred. Strathmore was there. He spent most of the gathering in conversation with Miss Vane near the window, and the conversation was animated, and she leaned forward once in the way she did when she was genuinely engaged by something, and I happened to be watching Callum's face at that precise moment, from across the room. He caught himself. I mean this precisely. I saw the expression arrive, not the managed, sideways attention, but the direct, unguarded expression of a man watching something that disturbs him with a specificity he has not previously admitted, and I saw him register it, and I saw him suppress it with the practiced speed of a man for whom suppression is reflex. But it had been there for 3 full seconds, completely unambiguous. He left the room on some pretext, I have since forgotten what, and was gone for 15 minutes. When he returned, he was entirely composed and remained so for the rest of the afternoon, and was perfectly civil to Strathmore, who left at 4 in a good humor. After the guests had gone, I was in the library when Callum came in and stood at the window for a moment with the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time, and has arrived, reluctantly, at the point of putting it down. He stood there long enough that I put down my book. "Are you all right?" I said. "I am fine," he said. This was the tone that means the exact opposite of fine, and we both knew it. I waited. He turned from the window and looked at me with the particular look that I associated with his moments of unwilling honesty. The look of a man who has decided, after considerable internal argument, that the cost of not saying the thing is higher than the cost of saying it. "If a man of Strathmore's situation were to pursue a serious interest in Miss Vane," he said, with a precision that was itself a kind of theater. The precision of someone choosing words very carefully because the choosing of them is a way of not choosing other words. That would be an entirely appropriate thing. It would, I agreed. She is without connections and without means. He has a good income and a rising career. It would be a suitable match. Suitable, I agreed. She would be comfortable. She would. He looked at me for a long moment. "Why," he said, "are you not saying anything?" "I am waiting," I said, "for you to finish telling me what you have decided about all of this." He turned back to the window. In the street below, a carriage was going past, and the sound of the horses was the only sound for a moment. "I have not decided anything," he said. "Callum," I said, "you have been making yourself miserable for 10 weeks and calling it a decision not to decide. I would like, if possible, to prevent the next 10 weeks going the same way." "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," I said, with the gentleness available to a man who has known someone for 22 years and is not going to be pleasant about this when being pleasant would make the whole thing worse. "You have known what I mean since October. It has cost you 4 or 5 evenings of very good supper and several nights of sleep, and a great deal of unnecessary time in the stable yard. And it is going to go on costing you at exactly this rate until you either acknowledge to yourself what you feel or you watch Miss Vane marry James Strathmore, which I am telling you now would be a genuine catastrophe from which I suspect neither of you would recover in the way you should." The silence after this was the kind that has texture. "She is my grandmother's companion," he said. "She is a woman of intelligence and dignity and character," I said, "who has been living in your house for 3 months. You are the Duke of Dunmore. There is not a soul in Edinburgh or in Scotland who would find the situation in any way unsuitable, and you know it. She has no fortune," I said. You have sufficient fortune for both of you and your grandchildren and a lighthouse if you want one. That has never been the issue, and you know that it has never been the issue." He turned from the window and sat down in the chair across from me with the abrupt, slightly defeated quality of a man who has been arguing with a tide and has recognized the futility. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly lowered, and he was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. I want to be clear about what this was, an admission so significant, from a man of his particular constitution, that it required a moment before I could respond to it. "I know," I said, "but you are a person who learns what he needs to learn. You always have been. The Latin before breakfast, the estate management, the fencing. You were not born knowing any of it, and you were terrible at all of it briefly, and then you were not." He looked at me from under his brow with the expression that combined not quite irritation and not quite amusement, and was, with Callum, usually both. "What you do," I said, "is you talk to her, not about the estate, not about the household. Talk to her the way you talk to me, which is, when you choose to, which you do not choose often enough, one of the genuine pleasures of my acquaintance. You are interesting when you talk, and she will notice." "And if she doesn't?" "She will," I said. "And if she doesn't, you will have done something brave and found out something true, and those are not small things." He stood up and went back to the window. He stood there for some time, looking at Charlotte Square in the January dark, and I sat with my book and said nothing further, and eventually he went to his room, and I sat alone in the library for a while, and I thought, we are past the halfway point now. The man has admitted that he doesn't know how to begin, and that is everything, because the only way past that particular obstacle is through it. What he did with my advice he did in his own fashion, which is to say methodically, without visible rush, in a way that someone who did not know him would not necessarily have recognized as acting on advice at all. But I knew him. He began in January to speak to her in ways he had not spoken before. Not grandly, nothing was grand with Callum, nothing flourished, but differently, with the quality of genuine inquiry rather than the quality of civility. He asked her, at breakfast one morning, what she had thought of the poet whose work the Dowager had read aloud the previous evening. This was the kind of question he addressed to me, or to no one, a genuine question about an actual opinion, not a conversation starter. She looked at him with a slight pause, the pause of someone recalibrating a situation, and then answered directly, and he considered what she said and said what he thought, and they spoke for 12 minutes about a poet who was not, in my view, worth 12 minutes but who served his purpose in the economy of the situation admirably. He told her at supper 3 days later that the repair at the East Pasture culvert had succeeded, the eastern wall having been addressed as she had indicated. He said this in a level, matter-of-fact way, but what he was doing, and he knew it and she knew it, and I watched both of them know it, was acknowledging that she had been right, and that it had mattered. She received it with the same level, matter-of-fact quality, but there was something in her face when he said it, a small, clear recognition. He asked her about Warwickshire, one evening when the Dowager had gone up early and I was pretending to read. Not in the circling, anecdotal way that Strathmore had asked, the charming way, the way that is about producing an effect, but directly, in the way he asked all questions, with the implication that he intended to listen to what she said. She told him in the spare, unornamented way she told all things, about the house and the river, and the horse she had had at 15, and the Latin verse her father had given her for her 18th birthday, and the way the November light came through the dining-room windows in the house she had grown up in. She told him these things as if they were simply true rather than sad, and he listened to all of it without interruption and without the small signals of sympathy that most people deploy when listening to a sad story, the nods, the small sounds, the expressions, and which are, I had once heard her say, among the more discouraging things about sympathy. He just listened, entirely, with his full attention. When she finished, he said, "What happened to the Latin verse?" Which was a question about a specific thing she had mentioned, and which told her that he had heard it all, every word, and that the specific things had been specific to him rather than simply the general texture of loss. She looked at him. "I have it," she said. "It came with me." And then, after a pause that was different from the pauses she usually allowed, "It is the only book from the house that is still mine." "Good," he said, simply. as if the Latin verse being safe was important to him, which, in the way of a man who has just admitted something without quite intending to, it was. She said nothing to this, but she did not look away. I turned a page of my book that I had not read. The next day I found Miss Vane in the morning room, and I asked her, with the careful indirection that the situation deserved, how she found the Edinburgh season. "Very well," she said. "And the company?" She looked at me with the level, honest look she gave to things she was deciding how to answer accurately. "The company is interesting," she said, "more than I expected." A pause. "Mr. Pemberton, your friend listens very well when he chooses to." "He does," I said. "It is not what I expected of him," she said, and looked at her work. "What did you expect?" She considered. "Someone who spoke and waited for the noise to stop," she said. "He is more interested than that." "He is," I said. "It is simply not visible until he decides to show it." She said nothing more, but she was thinking about something in the private, inward way she had, and I did not press. January moved through its cold middle. Edinburgh was bright and dense and full of itself, and the Dunmore party moved through it in the pattern that the Dowager had arranged. The suppers and the assemblies and the evenings at the theater and the gatherings in the good drawing rooms of people worth sitting with. The theater was the 15th of January. The play was a comedy, not light enough to be trivial, not heavy enough to be demanding, and we sat in the Dunmore box, the Dowager and I in front, Callum and Miss Vane behind. I had a clear view of both of them in my peripheral vision, which was not, I confess, entirely accidental. The play was well performed, mostly. In the second act there was a speech, the comedy's heroine, at a moment of reversal, delivering a piece about the particular indignity of being overlooked, about the experience of being invisible to the many and seen clearly by the one, and what that clarity means when it finally arrives. It was a speech about recognition, about the difference between being in a room and being in the room. The actress played it well enough that it landed. And I heard behind me a very small, very soft sound from Miss Vane. Not a laugh, not a sob, the particular, involuntary sound of recognition, of something finding a place in someone that had been waiting for it. A beat later, the very slight shift of a chair beside her. I did not turn around. At the interval in the corridor with our glasses, I was near enough to hear when she said to Callum, "The actress plays the third line too heavily. The writer means it to be dry." He looked at her, the third line. She quoted it, the line about what would anyone know of a person who had not taken the trouble to ask, and explained, without heat, the difference between the ironic reading and the grievance reading, why the ironic reading gave the character more dignity, why the actress had made the worse choice. He listened to all of this carefully. Then he said, "She hasn't moved past needing them to know, the character." "No," she said, "but the writer meant the pretense of having done so." "The pretense is the dignity." A pause settled between them that was different from the other pauses, warmer, slightly more deliberate. The pause of two people who are both aware that they are saying something and are deciding how much of it to acknowledge. "Did you find it accurate?" he said carefully. "The speech from your own." "Yes," she said, before he could finish it, directly, without elaboration, without softening it with qualification or leavening it with humor. "Quite accurate." "I thought so," he said, very quietly, as if he were confirming something he had already observed from somewhere she had not known he was looking. The bell rang for the second half. We went back to our seats. I looked at the Dowager. She was looking at the stage with the expression of a woman who is attending a performance that is going precisely as it ought to. The Thursday announcement came on the 21st of January. The Dowager had been building toward something all week. I knew it because she had a particular quality in the days before she delivered a decisive thing, a stillness, a slight increase in the precision of her small courtesies, the look of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has decided that patience has served its purpose, and it is now time to act. She had that quality all of the week of the 21st, and I watched it with the attention of someone who knows the difference between the Dowager being comfortable and the Dowager being arranged. It was Thursday morning. She came down to breakfast in her full formal manner, the posture, the particular organization of her dress that signaled to anyone who knew her that she had decided something, and sat, and poured her tea. And when the breakfast was at its ordinary midpoint, she said, without preamble, I shall be returning to Dunmore at the end of next week." The table received this. Callum looked at her with the expression of a man receiving unexpected information and processing it with more internal activity than his face was showing. "The end of next week," he said. "Friday fortnight," she said crisply. "Miss Vane will accompany me. My things are quite simple to organize. I shall require the coach on Friday morning." She said it as if the matter were entirely practical and required only logistics, and then she returned to her toast, and the breakfast continued around this announcement for perhaps 3 minutes before it became clear that the matter was settled, and the breakfast might as well proceed. I watched Miss Vane during those 3 minutes. She received the announcement with her characteristic composure, and she said what was appropriate, yes, of course. She would ensure the Dowager's things were organized, and she said nothing about her own preferences or her own reception of the situation, and she did not look at Callum. Callum said nothing. He ate his breakfast with the controlled, ordinary movements of a man who has received information that requires him to think and is thinking. After breakfast, he left for the library. Miss Vane went with the Dowager to the morning room. I sat in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house, and then I went to find something else to do. The Dowager had set a deadline. It was Thursday, which gave Callum 8 days. The Dowager knew what she was doing. She knew precisely what she was doing. 8 days is enough time for a man who is ready, and not enough time for a man who intends to think about being ready for a further 3 months. And she had made the calculation with the accuracy of a woman who had known her grandson for 64 years, and knew the difference between a man who needs more time and a man who needs less of it. He had, I observed, until Thursday fortnight. I observed him, those 8 days, with the full attention of a man watching something important unfold and not wanting to miss it. He was restless in the way that he was rarely restless. Not obviously, not with the pacing or the distraction that restlessness looks like in other men, but with a particular quality of controlled energy that expressed itself in the things he attended to. He rode in the mornings longer than he had been writing. He spent time in the library but was, I suspected, not reading. He was present at all the meals and all the evenings, and he was attentive in all the ways he had been increasingly attentive since early January, the genuine questions, the full listening, the specific responses to specific things. But there was, in addition to all of this, the quality of a man marshaling himself, coming to terms with something, deciding. She noticed, I could not have said exactly how I knew this. She was, as always, composed and equable and gave nothing away unless she chose to. But she was not unaware of the changed quality of the 8 days, and she was attending to something in her own quiet way. The morning room on the 26th was where the most significant small conversation occurred. I know about it because she told me, some months later, having decided that I deserved to know it, and I have thought about it often since. She was in the morning room, the room that caught the best winter light, in the southeast corner, writing correspondence. Callum came in, which was unusual. The morning room was not where he generally came when he was looking for company or occupation. He came in and stood by the window for a moment, looking at Charlotte Square, and she continued with her letter because it was her discipline not to stop what she was doing when he entered rooms. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace, when you return to Dunmore," he said carefully in the tone of a man who has prepared what he is going to say but is delivering it very precisely, "I should like if you are willing to discuss the organization of the estate correspondence. There is a system I have been considering. You have some familiarity with the estate by now. I would value your thoughts." She put down her pen and looked at him. He held her look with the direct, level look he gave to all important things. "That is a domestic matter," she said with precision, "for the housekeeper or the steward." "It is an administrative matter," he said, "and you are better at administrative things than either of them." "Your Grace," she said, and her tone was quiet and quite clear, "if you have something to say, I should prefer you to say it plainly." The silence that followed this, she told me, was the longest silence she had experienced in the presence of another person. Then he said, "I am not good at this." "I have noticed," she said. "I am aware of the asymmetry," he said, with the controlled steadiness of someone saying a true thing that costs them something. "You are without independence and without a permanent situation, and I have an estate and a title and a great deal more room to maneuver than you have. I do not intend to use that too." He stopped, started again. I am not asking for any kind of answer today. I am asking you to know that I have a question I intend to ask, and that it is not about the correspondence." She looked at him for a long moment with the honest, accurate look of someone taking inventory. "When?" she said. "The garden," he said, "when we are home." She nodded once with a brevity that was not coldness but decisiveness, the nod of a person who has agreed to a thing and will honor it. "All right," she said. He nodded back, left. She sat for a long time in the morning room in the January light. She told me, and when she took up her pen again she wrote nothing for several minutes, and when she finally wrote it was very slowly, because her attention was not, at that moment, on the correspondence. She had not said yes. She had said all right, which is, and she knew this, and she intended it, and I thought when she told me that it was exactly right, a different thing. Yes is the answer. All right is, I am listening, and I will hear you out, and I am not running away from this, and you have my attention, and what comes next will determine what comes next. It was the only honest answer. She was not going to give him a yes in a morning room before she had heard what he actually said. But she also had not, I understood, been unwilling. We left Edinburgh on the Friday. The journey north was the journey south reversed in all its practical dimensions, and in all its weather. They had had 2 inches of snow overnight, and the world was white and still, and the Charlotte Square house was shut up with its usual efficiency, and the coach went north through the white country toward Dunmore. She rode in the coach with the Dowager. He rode alongside, for most of it, on the roads where riding was possible. In the sections where the road narrowed or the ground was difficult he came alongside the coach, and once when the road was briefly wide enough he was at the window, and they were talking, not at length, but steadily, the way you talk to someone you have decided to talk to, not the way you talk to someone you are performing for. I rode beside the coach and heard very little of it. I looked at the sky and at the Dunmore country as it began to appear, the bare winter fields and the gray-brown hillsides and the dark outline of the castle in the last light of the afternoon, and I thought, we are going to be all right. All of us. This is going to come right. Dunmore in February was Dunmore in February. Cold, bone certain of itself, the stone walls holding in the way that old stone holds, with the patience of things that have been standing for a long time and intend to go on standing. The fires were lit when they arrived, as they always were, with the house's usual competence in the matter of arrival, and the hall smelled of wood smoke and the particular dry cold of a stone house that has been shut up and is warming again, and the Dowager went to the drawing-room, and Miss Vane attended to the unpacking with the organized efficiency she brought to all such tasks. And Callum went to the estate room within the hour, because there were 2 months of accumulated matters that required him, and he was the sort of man who dealt with the accumulated things before he dealt with the other things. That was the Saturday. The garden walk was the Tuesday. He had told her when we are home. He had not said when with any particularity, and she had not pressed. She conducted herself in the interval with the same composed, equable competence she brought to all things, attending to the Dowager's requirements and the household's requirements and her own particular, quiet life within the household. And she did not seek him out, and did not avoid him, and was, in the ordinary run of Tuesday morning, on her way back from the kitchen garden. She had been inspecting whether the forcing frame had survived the January frost, for the Dowager who wanted early lettuces. When he was on the same path, coming from the stables, "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "The East Garden," he said. It was not a question. It was in the key of a proposition offered without the pretense that the answer was in doubt. She folded the small notebook she was carrying and put it in her coat pocket and said, "Yes, all right." The East Garden at Dunmore in February was the walled kitchen garden's neighbor, less formal than the front parterre, with the old stone wall that enclosed it on 3 sides and the 4th open to the country, and the bare rose standards in their beds, and the gravel path between them that was, in February, gray and clean and very clear. They walked in it side by side with the comfortable physical ease that had been building since October, when they had learned, somewhere between the stable yard and the culvert and the Edinburgh drawing rooms and the pianoforte evenings, that they did not collide when they walked, that they were, spatially, at ease with each other in a way that is not manufactured and cannot be performed, and either is or isn't. He did not take long to begin. "I said in Edinburgh that I had a question," he said. "I should like to ask it now." "Yes," she said. "I should like you to be my wife." She stopped walking. He He stopped a half-step after, and turned to look at her with the direct, level look he gave to all the important things in his life. The same look he gave the estate problem that required his whole attention. The same look he had given the flooded culvert and the breach in the east wall. Except that the look, when directed at a person rather than a problem, contained something that was not calculation but was very open, very undefended, and would have been called vulnerability in a man less armored than Callum, though I think the word that fits him better is honesty. The look of a man who has taken off the armor for this particular thing and is standing in front of you in the February cold without it. "I have not managed this well," he said. "I am aware of that. I have taken longer than I ought at every stage, and you have been patient with my taking longer, and I cannot be certain whether that patience is the patience of someone who was waiting for me or the patience of someone who was simply waiting for the situation to reach its natural conclusion." She looked at him, he waited. "Both, perhaps," she said, with the honest accuracy she brought to all assessments. "At the beginning it was the second. I was new and I was careful. Later," she paused, the brief pause of someone selecting a true thing from several available true things. "Later it was more the first." "When?" he said, directly, because he was a man who, once committed to a conversation, committed to it fully. She thought about this with the serious attention she gave to questions worth serious attention. "November," she said, finally. "The harpsichord evening. You asked me to continue playing. It was not a kind of ask I had expected from you. And then the following morning you told me about the culvert, and I thought, he is noting what I notice. I had not expected to be noted." "You are more than noted," he said, quietly and with the particular gravity that he brought to the statements he was certain of, the statements that had been weighed and found true and were offered without qualification. "I find that I have been attending to you since October, and that I cannot now stop attending to you and have no desire to, and that the prospect of Edinburgh without you in it, or Dunmore without you in it, or any arrangement of my daily life in which you are not present, is a prospect I am entirely unwilling to entertain." She stood with her hands folded over her coat, and her face in the February light very still and quite clear, and she looked at him with the look that was her honest look, the look that did not perform anything, that simply registered what was in front of it. "I am without resources," she said, directly, not apologetically. "I have a small amount that I have saved over several years and the Latin verse and the habit of not requiring very much. I am not bringing you anything materially." "I am aware of what you are bringing me," he said, "and I have considered the balance carefully. I would like you to understand that when I ask you, I am asking with the full understanding of all of it." "Your estate," she said with the same directness, because she was a woman who named the real things rather than leaving them implicit. "Your household, your grandmother who planned this and knows she planned this and is at this moment in the drawing room with her embroidery and her satisfied expression. Your tenants, who have opinions about who the Duchess of Dunmore ought to be. Your Edinburgh acquaintances who will also have opinions." "My tenants," he said, "saw you fix the east wall problem in November. 3 of them have mentioned you to me since, in the favorable light." She almost smiled. "And Edinburgh?" "Edinburgh," he said, "has a great many opinions, and I have never found any of them particularly binding." This time she did smile, briefly, the real smile, the unguarded one. And then the smile settled into something quieter and more serious, and she said, "Callum." It was the first time, in all of it, that she had used his name without the title. It arrived in the February air between them with the weight of a decision. He was very still. "I am not campaigning," she said. "I was not campaigning in October, and I was not campaigning in November, and I was not campaigning in Edinburgh, and I will not begin now, and I think you knew that, and I think you knew it was true, and I think that matters to you." "It matters very much to me," he said. "Good," she said, "then yes." He did not, as another man might, make a dramatic event of this. There was no exclamation, no sudden forward movement. What he did was reach out and take her hand, the right hand, gloved, folded with her other hand over her coat, and hold it carefully with the careful, certain grip of a man who has decided something and is holding it. They stood there in the east garden for a while, in the February cold, in the pale winter sunlight, and said nothing, and did not need to. After some time he said, "I should like to speak to my grandmother." "She knows," Isadora said, perfectly level. A pause. "Of course she does," he said. And he said it with, there was something in his voice, saying it, that I heard about later and have thought about since. Not irritation and not quite amusement, and something warm underneath both. The sound of a man who has been maneuvered with great skill and patience and genuine love and finds, at the conclusion of the maneuvering, that he is exactly where he would choose to be and cannot, honestly, resent the route. She chose you, he said after a moment, not the grandmother, not Isadora. He was speaking of it directly now, the whole thing, the letter, the application, the October arrival, the year's patient work. She chose me, Isadora confirmed, without performance, without false modesty. She was right, he said. She generally is, said Isadora. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. Not quite, it had not yet become that easy, but the nearest thing to a laugh I had been told he had produced in some considerable time. And they walked together back toward the house, his hand having released hers in the practical way of people returning from a garden and requiring both hands, but still in the close, changed proximity of two people for whom something has been decided and does not need to be stated. I was, as it happened, in the corridor when they came back in. I had not planned this. I had been returning a book to the library. Callum looked at me. Well, I said. You may congratulate me, he said, and then tell the Dowager who already knows. He went to the estate room. She went to the stairs. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went to the drawing room. The Dowager was in her chair. She had her embroidery in her lap. She was not doing it. She was looking at the fire with the particular expression of a woman who has spent a year and several months on a problem and has just seen the solution arrive exactly as she designed it. Your Grace, I said. She looked up at me with her clear, steady eyes. You knew, I said. I hoped, she said precisely. There is a difference, a pause, though I will admit that by November I was fairly certain. The letter, I said. You chose her from the application letter. I chose her from the application letter, she confirmed. 87 applications. 72 of them were women performing the qualities they thought I wanted. 12 were women who had some of the qualities and were honest about which ones they lacked. 3 were women who wrote as they actually were, without calculation. She looked at the fire. Isadora's letter was one of those 3. She wrote that she was a debtor's daughter and had been in straitened circumstances for 4 years, and had learned, in those 4 years, exactly what she could do without and what she could not, and that music was in the second category and pretense in the first. She said she was direct and preferred directness in return and would not be a decorative companion but might be a useful one. A slight pause. It was a remarkable letter, I thought. This woman and my grandson will understand each other perfectly. He will hate it at first, and then he will be unable to stop. You were right, I said. I generally am, she said, with the serenity of a woman who has been right about the important things for 71 years and has made her peace with it. She returned to her embroidery. I stood for a moment, watching the fire. Cecilia, I said, because I had known her long enough for this. She looked up. That was beautifully done, I said. She smiled. The smile of a woman who has arranged something with complete skill and perfect patience, and is not going to be falsely modest about the quality of the arrangement. Yes, she said, I rather think it was. The February days that followed the East Garden had a different quality than the February days before it. Not dramatically different. Dunmore did not do dramatics, and neither did the two of them, but unmistakably different, in the way that a room has a different quality when a window is opened. The same room, the same furniture, and yet the air is not the same air. They were together more, in the ordinary way of two people who have decided to be together, and the being together had the ease that I had been watching build since October, the ease that you cannot manufacture, but that, once it exists, is unmistakable. They moved through the Dunmore days with the practical, adjacent quality of two people who have learned to work in the same space without friction. The breakfast conversations that extended past breakfast, the evening discussions that began as household matters and ended somewhere else entirely, the moments in the library where she brought him something she had read and he read it with genuine interest and said what he thought about it. He said what he thought about things to her, increasingly. This was the change I observed most steadily in February and March. The slow unfastening of the particular carefulness with which he had always held himself in company. The reduction, not the elimination. He would always be private. It was the architecture of him. but the reduction of the distance he maintained between what he thought and what he said when she was the person he was saying it to. She, for her part, was the same. This was both the simplest and the most significant thing about her. She was the same. At Dunmore in October and in Edinburgh in December and in the morning room on the 26th of January and in the East Garden on the February Tuesday, she was the same person at the same register, saying the same kind of true things with the same level, honest directness. This is a rarer quality than it sounds, particularly in the conditions available to a woman of her situation. The conditions that in most cases reward performance and penalize honesty, and I thought, watching them in the February evenings, that it was precisely this that had dismantled him. Not beauty, not charm, not the calculated deployment of either, but the steady, unbroken fact of her being exactly what she was, without edit, without apology, without petition. He had spent his adult life being managed, by his estate's needs, by Edinburgh's opinions, by the social world's constant low-grade pressure on him to be its idea of the Highland Duke of Dunmore. She had not managed him. She had simply been present and accurate and herself. It had been, for a man of his constitution, devastating. The announcement went to Edinburgh by the usual social channels, which is to say that the Dowager wrote a very precise letter to 3 specific people, and within a fortnight the relevant circles knew, and the relevant circles had opinions, as Edinburgh always has opinions, but the opinions were, on the whole, the positive kind. The accounts I received were gratifying rather than otherwise. She had been seen at the assembly rooms, she had been seen at the suppers, she had demonstrated intelligence and deportment, and the capacity to hold a conversation about Roman drainage systems with a professor who had previously been considered unconversation-able. And she had the Dowager's visible approval, which in Edinburgh was a form of endorsement not easily dismissed. There was one objection, from a particular quarter, that was expressed with the specific sharpness of the Edinburgh drawing rooms when they are dissatisfied. The statement, attributed to a person I choose not to name, that the Duke of Dunmore might have done considerably better for himself than a debtor's daughter, and that the Dowager, who was charming but had always been eccentric, had perhaps in this instance overstepped the line between family management and family interference. I heard about this remark third-hand, through a mutual acquaintance, some weeks after it was made, and I confess that I had a private moment of anticipating how this particular remark was going to meet Miss Vane. It met her at a gathering in late March in Edinburgh. We went down briefly, Callum and Isadora and I, without the Dowager who had gone to her sister at Peebles. And the person who had made the original remark was present, and made, in a drawing room with 12 people in it, a comment that was not quite the original remark, but was its cousin. Something about the charming novelty of Dunmore's choice, with the precise social loading of the word novelty that everyone in the room understood, and that was intended to land precisely as it landed. The room, when it landed, was very briefly quiet. Isadora said, with the level, pleasant directness of someone making a factual statement, "I understand that the Duke of Dunmore might have selected differently. He may still, if he finds the novelty has worn off. In the meantime, I find the attachment well suited, and am content to remain in it as long as it serves us both." The room was quiet for a different reason than before. Callum, beside her, made a sound very low in his throat that anyone who did not know him would not have identified as anything, and that I identified as laughter. He said nothing. He did not need to. The expression on his face, looking at her in the moment after she said it, the expression of a man watching someone do a thing he himself would have done if he had thought of it as well as she had done it, was sufficient, and was not, in the subsequent account, forgotten by anyone who saw it. She had answered it for herself. She had not looked to him for it. That, more even than the words, was the thing that mattered. After they left the gathering, she said to him, in the carriage, very simply, "I hope that was all right." "It was exactly right," he said. "I would only have been rude. You were precise." "Rudeness has its uses," she said. "Not on that particular subject," he said, and there was something in his tone, underneath the ordinary register of the comment, that said, "That particular subject is mine, and I will not have it questioned, and she is it, and I am not in the habit of explaining myself, but I would explain this if anyone required it, and they would not find it a comfortable explanation." She looked at him. He met the look. "All right," she said, the same words she had used in the morning room. The same quality, assent without performance, agreement without submission. The carriage went on through the March streets toward the townhouse. and the Edinburgh night was cold and clear and full of its own noise, and neither of them said anything further for a while, and both of them were, I observed from my corner of the carriage, entirely satisfied. March at Dunmore had a particular quality that I had not witnessed in previous years, because the previous years had not had Isadora Vane in them. The fires were lit throughout, which was a change. Callum had been a man who kept only the rooms he needed warm, on the basis that a man who required warmth could put on another coat, and the music room was in use in the evenings, which it had not previously been in any sustained way. The pianoforte had been moved up from Charlotte Square, which had been her suggestion, and which he had arranged without comment, and she played in the evenings with the quality she had always played with, and the additional quality of a woman playing in a room that is becoming hers. He listened. Sometimes he came and sat with a book, and the book was not the point. Sometimes he came and sat with nothing and simply listened, and when she finished something she would turn and find him looking at her, and neither of them would say anything, and the room would hold it. The estate consultations began in March. He had mentioned in Edinburgh that he valued her thoughts on the estate correspondence, and she had answered that particular attempt with the directness it deserved. But the thing underneath it, that he wanted her views on the estate, that he had been noting her observations since November, that her reading of the land and the tenants and the organization of things was accurate and useful, that was true. And in March he acted on it in the direct way he acted on things he had decided on. He brought her into the estate discussions. Not as a participant in the formal way. The steward and the estate manager did not require her presence, and she did not require theirs. But in the evenings, when it was the two of them in the library or the sitting room, he talked about the estate problems the way he talked about them with me. Directly, seriously, expecting a real answer. She gave real answers. She had seen the drainage problem in November. She had read the tenancy agreements in January and noted that two of them had clauses that had not been enforced in the way the original drafting required, which she mentioned to him with the careful precision of someone noting a fact rather than making an accusation. She had been, in her quiet way, watching the Dunmore estate with the attention she gave to all things she was responsible for, and now she was responsible for it in a different way, and the depth of her attention to it was visible and was, I think, among the things that most directly satisfied him. He was not a man who wanted a wife who was decorative. He was a man who wanted a wife who would help him. He had never said this. He was not a man who said the important things about himself, in general, but it was evident, and she was what he wanted, and he knew it. And the knowledge had about it the quality of an unexpected discovery, even though it had been possible to deduce it at any point from the evidence available. She was his competent person, he was hers. This is, I believe, one of the better bases for a marriage, and they had found it without either of them intending to find anything, which is also one of the better ways. The Dowager had her conversation with him in the 3rd week of March. I know about this one because she told me directly, with the slight, satisfied precision of a woman delivering an account of something that has gone exactly as intended. She had asked to see him in the morning room. She was seated by the window in her particular upright way, and he sat across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other with the look of two people who know each other very completely and are aware of what the other knows. "You are content," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "She is content." "I believe so," he said. "She does not perform contentment. When she is something, it is visible." "It is," the Dowager agreed. A pause. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "I generally do," he said. "When you are with her," she said carefully, "and she is doing whatever she is doing, reading or managing the household or playing or simply present in the room, what is the quality of that?" He thought about this. He was a man who thought before he answered questions that required thinking about, and she waited, having always known this and having always honored it. "Like a correct sum," he said finally. "When a column of numbers adds up to what it ought to add up to, there is a rightness. That is the only word I have for it." "That is an excellent word for it," she said. "You are going to tell me you knew this would be the case," he said. "I'm going to tell you," she said, with the gentle, perfectly calibrated delivery of a woman who had earned the right to this, "that I knew it was possible. I did not know it would be the case. I hoped. The letter was remarkable, and she herself was remarkable, and you are not simple to know, but once known you are worth knowing, and I hoped she would see that, and I hoped you would permit it to be seen." She paused. You were more stubborn than I had anticipated, even by your standards. I am not stubborn, he said. I am careful. You are both, she said pleasantly. And you were both about this, rather past the point of usefulness. He looked at her with the expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement, and was his default expression when confronted with something true he did not want to be confronted with. I was right in the end, he said. You were also lucky, she said, that she is not a woman who required speed. Some women would not have had the patience. I know, he said, quietly, with the tone of a man who has thought about this and does not require it elaborated. The Dowager looked at him for a moment with the look she had given him, I think, across his whole life. The look that combined the entirety of her knowledge of him. The child, the young man, the armored man he had become, and the less armored man he was becoming, into a single, clear, warm regard. She is right for you, she said. And you are right for her, which is perhaps less obvious but equally true. She has been managing alone for a long time. She is very good at it. She will be better for having someone alongside. He did not answer this. He nodded once with the economy of a man receiving something true and filing it with care. And you, the Dowager continued, have been managing alone for a long time too. You are very good at it. You will be better for having someone alongside. He nodded again. She looked at him with the warmth of someone who has done a thing well and knows it. I chose well, she said, with the simple certainty of fact. You did, he said. Grandmother, a pause, thank you. She looked at him for a moment. Callum did not, as a rule, say thank you. He expressed gratitude through action and through loyalty, and through the reliable presence that had characterized his relationships with the people he valued, and the explicit word was not his usual instrument. She received it, therefore, with the fullness it deserved. You are welcome, she said. Now go and deal with the east pasture fence before the lambs arrive, because Robson has been worrying about it for a fortnight, and you haven't addressed it yet. He stood up. The conversation was over. He went to deal with the fence. She returned to her window, her embroidery, her fire. I sat in the corridor and heard the morning room door close, and then the front door close after him, and I thought, there it is. The whole thing. Done and done perfectly, and with the skill that was hers and no one else's, and the 64 years of knowing him that made her the only person who could have done it. The formal proposal, the ring, the drawing room, was on a Friday evening in late March. He had the ring from his mother's things. Not the Dunmore engagement ring, which was a formal piece of considerable size and formality, and which he and I had discussed, and which he had decided, correctly, was not right for her. It was a piece that required a certain kind of woman to carry it, and she was a different kind of woman, and would have carried it with composure but not with pleasure. His mother had had among her things a sapphire in a plain rose gold setting, modest and clear-cut and excellent, which had been his grandmother's first. A young woman's ring, chosen when Cecilia was not yet the Dowager but simply a woman of 22 who wanted something real, and which had come down to his mother, and was now his to give or not to give. He showed it to the Dowager, who looked at it and then at him and said, yes, with complete certainty. He showed it to me because we had known each other for 22 years, and this was the kind of thing you showed people you had known for 22 years. I looked at it and said, it is exactly right, and it was. She came down for the evening at 7:30. The Dowager was in the drawing room, which was usual, and I was there, which was usual, and Callum was there, which was less usual. He was generally in the estate room at this hour and came in for supper, and she took in the specific quality of the room with her accurate eye and said nothing and sat. He crossed the room, stood before her. She looked up at him with a direct, level look. I said in October that I am not good at beginnings, he said. I believe I have improved. You have, she said. He took the ring from his coat pocket and held it out to her, and she looked at it, the honest looking, the real look, the look that assessed things accurately, and something in her face changed, and what changed was the composed stillness of it. Not a loss of composure, but a softening of it, the expression of a woman who has been controlled for a long time and is lowering the control in the presence of someone she trusts enough to lower it for. It was my grandmother's, he said. Then my mother's. It is the right size for your hand. She looked up at him from the ring. You measured my hand, she said. Your glove, he said. The right one in January. You left it in the morning room on the 6th. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a different quality of directness than usual, the directness of something said from the inside rather than from the surface. "You have been paying attention since January." "Since October," he said exactly. She held out her hand. He put the ring on. It was the right size. She looked at her hand, and then at him, and I am glad I was there to see this, and I have thought about it many times since. She took his hand, the hand that had put the ring on, and held it with both of hers, and held it with the firm, clear grip of someone who has taken hold of something and intends to keep it. "Callum," she said. "Isadora," he said, for the first time, her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, even precise, and with something underneath that was entirely his and entirely for her, was the sound of a man arriving somewhere. The Dowager in her chair with her embroidery made no sound at all. She was smiling at the fire with the smile of a woman for whom everything has gone exactly, completely right. I looked at the ceiling, because a man must maintain some dignity. They were married in May. The church at Dunmore Village was the church the Errols had always used. Small, old stone, the kind of church that has been absorbing the weather of several centuries and is entirely at peace with it. The stone inside was the same pale, close-grained gray as the castle stone, and the windows were clear glass, plain northern light, the good Scottish light of a May morning that was cold but fine, with the high blue sky that you get in that country when it decides to be generous. The pews held the people of the estate and the neighboring families, and a number of people from Edinburgh, and the Dowager in the front pew, in the good gray silk she had had for 20 years and wore on the occasions she considered worth wearing it. She came in on my arm at her request. There was no father, no brother, no available male relation, and the question of who should give her that particular escort had been answered by her with the directness she brought to all questions. She had looked at me and said, "Would you do it, Aldrich?" in the matter-of-fact tone of someone asking whether I would mind passing the salt, and I had said yes with some difficulty, and recovered myself as quickly as possible, because it would not do to make a scene about it in the library. She wore a dress of good ivory silk that was elegant and not elaborate. Her hair was dressed as she always dressed it, with the simplicity she brought to her person, and she carried white heather, his choice, or the Dowager's, or both. I was never entirely clear. And she walked in with the composure she walked into everything, the level bearing and the clear eyes, and the quality of being exactly herself in exactly this moment with no trace of performance about any of it. He was at the front of the church. He watched her come in, and his face, which I had a clear view of from where I walked beside her, was the face of a man doing no managing at all. He was simply looking at her. Fully, openly, without the sideways quality, and without the managed awareness, and without any of the armor that had been. For the 14 years I had known him as a man rather than a boy, the consistent companion of his expression. He was just looking at her with the plain, undefended expression of a man who has found the thing he wants most and is watching it come toward him, and I have seen few expressions in my life that were more worth seeing. She reached him, she looked at him. The ceremony was brief and clearly conducted by the minister, who had known Callum since childhood and found the occasion, I could see, more moving than he had expected. The vows were the old form, direct and serious and without ornament, and Callum said his with the precision and gravity of a man for whom words, when said, are meant. And she said hers with the same, and the ring, a band that matched the sapphire, which he had made in Edinburgh in March and which was exactly right, went on her hand beside the engagement ring, and the minister said the last words, and it was done. He took her hand after, and she let him take it, and they came back down the aisle with the composed, unhurried ease of two people who are exactly where they have chosen to be. Outside the church in the May morning, in the thin, good Scottish sunshine, with the estate people around them and the village around them and the castle in the middle distance gray against the sky, he turned to her and said something that I was not close enough to hear, very quietly and very specifically just to her. She looked at him. She smiled the real smile, the unguarded one, brief and clear and entirely real. And she said something back, and the expression on his face receiving it was the expression I had seen 4 seconds of at the assembly rooms in December, which is to say the expression of a man seeing clearly what he most wants and understanding, this time, that it is his. I have often thought since that the most significant thing was not the vows or the ring or any of the formal events of that May morning, but that moment outside the church. The two of them in the ordinary sunlight, with the estate and the village around them, saying something small and particular to each other, and both of them smiling, and neither of them performing. That was the real thing. That was what the year had been for. The celebrations that followed were, by Dunmore's standard, considerable. A supper at the castle for the estate and the village that was done with the kind of warm, unshowy abundance that suggests a household that has been planning the thing properly for some time and is glad to do it well. The Dowager moved through it with the serene, pleasured authority of a woman at the triumph of a long work. I drank rather more than I usually permitted myself and was not sorry for it. In the evening, when the guests had thinned and the fires were lower, I found the Dowager in the drawing-room with her embroidery in her lap, which had not been worked on for some time, and her eyes on the fire. "Well," I said. She looked up at me. Her expression was the expression of someone surveying from the far end a long view that has been exactly worth the journey. "Very well," she said precisely. "Are you satisfied?" I said. "Entirely," she said, "and so are they, which is the point." I sat down. The fire was warm. Somewhere in the castle, the two of them were in whichever room they were in, and the Dunmore rooms that had been cold and underpopulated for 14 years were warm tonight throughout the whole house, and the music room was warm, and the east garden would be warm in the morning, and the pastures and the culverts and the tenancies and the correspondence and the whole particular, complicated, bone-deep life of the place was in good hands, both their hands, not one pair, and there was. Sitting in the drawing-room with the fire and the Dowager, and the quiet of a May evening in Scotland, a sense of rightness about all of it that did not require stating. The Dowager went up at 9. At the door she turned and looked at me with the clear, warm, knowing look she had had since I was 23, and had come down to Dunmore for the first time with my new friend who didn't know how to talk to people, and she said, "He needed someone who wouldn't manage him, Aldrich. He had been managed all his life, and it had made him very closed up and very reliable and very alone. She didn't manage him. She was simply there, being herself, which is a thing that is rarer than people understand." "It is," I said. "Keep an eye on them for me," she said. "Not because they need it, because you love them." "Yes," I said, "I do." She smiled. She went upstairs. I sat with the fire. The years that followed were, in the way that good years are, not the years of the kind of story that requires telling in any dramatic sense. They were years of work and weather, and the steady, accumulating life of an estate and a household managed by two people who were, between them, very competent, and who had the additional and less common quality of making each other better at the things they each did. I will not tell you that it was always easy, because it was not. Callum was not easy. He had been a contained, armored, self-sufficient man for 34 years, and the habits of 34 years do not dissolve entirely because one has made a happy marriage. They thin, they loosen, they are worked on steadily by the pressure of daily intimacy with another person who is very clear-eyed and not going to pretend they are not there. But they do not disappear. There were evenings when he withdrew into himself, and the withdrawal was complete and not, strictly speaking, fair. There were occasions when the old armor went back on for no reason that was fully articulable, and the house had the cool, careful quality of Dunmore before October, and she recognized it and did not attempt to force the door and waited, and he came back, because with her waiting he always came back. She was not easy either. She was direct in the way that honest people are, which means she said the true things, and some of the true things were not comfortable, and she did not soften them past the point of clarity. She had learned, in her years of managing alone, a certain independence that was her deepest quality, and that was also, occasionally, in the specific context of not being alone any longer. A complicating one. The habit of solving problems by herself, of not expecting help, of deciding that help was not necessary before she had fully tested whether it was available. He noticed this with the attentive accuracy of a man who notices things about her specifically, and one evening in the second autumn he said, "You do not ask." "I ask," she said. "Not for things that matter," he said. "You ask about logistics, you ask about the estate, you ask about the tenancies and the drainage and what I think about the correspondence. You do not ask for the other things." She looked at him. What other things? He was quiet for a moment, organizing, because he was a man who organized before he delivered important things. "The things that are difficult," he said. "I see when they are difficult, you do not tell me." She was quiet in return. Not the defensive quiet, but the genuine considering quiet, the quiet of someone who has been shown something accurate and is examining it honestly. "It is a habit," she said, "from the years when there was no one to tell." "Those years are finished," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look with the full, open patience he had developed since October, not the patience of a man managing a situation, but the patience of a man who has understood that some things are worth waiting for and is willing to wait for them. "Yes," she said finally, "they are." After that she told him more. Not all at once, it was not the kind of thing that changes all at once, but gradually, in the way that a door that has been closed for a long time opens. Slowly, with some resistance at the hinge, and then more easily, and then as if it had always been open. He was, when she told him difficult things, the same as he was when he listened to everything else. Fully present, without the small sounds of sympathy, without the expressions that are more about the listener's own experience of the emotion than about the speaker's. He simply listened, and when he said anything, he said something specific and true, and it was in the nature of a man of few words that when the few words arrived they were the right ones. The estate in the years after the wedding was a different estate from the estate of the years before, and the change was not dramatic and was not sudden, but was the steady, observable change of a place that is being properly attended to by two people rather than one. She had been right about the east wall breach in November, and right about the tenancy clauses in January, and she went on being right about things with the same quiet, accurate frequency, and he listened and acted. And the results were visible in the drainage and the pastures and the tenancy relationships and the books, which balanced better than they had balanced in the difficult years of the late 80s when the harvests had been poor and the decisions had been made alone. She organized the household in the way she organized all things, not grandly, not with pronouncement or restructuring, but by looking carefully at what was there, identifying the specific inefficiencies, and addressing them one at a time in a manner so natural that it was occasionally some time before anyone realized that things were different from before. The linen system she had helped the housekeeper establish in November had been only the first example. By the end of the first year, the whole domestic organization of Dunmore had been quietly and completely overhauled, and everyone in it was both more comfortable and more efficient, and no one had been made to feel that what they had done before was wrong. She had a gift for this, for managing things, systems, people, situations, in a way that did not produce resistance, that found what was already working and built on it rather than replacing it. It was the gift, I thought, of someone who had spent years attending to the world around her with genuine interest rather than with the mild, polite attentiveness that is common and does not see very much. In the third year, there was a child. Margaret Cecilia, born in a February that had the same quality as the February of the East Garden Walk. Cold, fine, with the particular stillness of Dunmore in winter. She was born at 3 in the morning with the brisk, no-nonsense quality that she maintained throughout her childhood, and that did not require any special explanation from anyone who knew her mother. I was at Dunmore for it, having arrived a fortnight before as I generally did when there was an event of consequence, and I was in the corridor at 3 in the morning when Callum came out of the room, and stood for a moment against the wall with his hands at his sides, and his eyes closed, and his face in an expression that I had never seen on it before, not the controlled, managed expressions, not the composure that was his baseline, but something entirely without defense, entirely open. The face of a man who has just been given something so large that he does not yet know what to do with it, and is simply holding very still while he adjusts to the size of it. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, then he looked at me. "A girl," he said, "both well." "Good," I said. He nodded. He went back in. I sat down on the floor of the corridor, which was not dignified, and thought about October, and the application letter, and the Dowager's 3 piles, and the harpsichord in the middle of the night, and the culvert in November, and the assembly rooms in December, and the morning room on the 26th of January, and the East Garden, and the ring in the drawing room, and the church in May. All of it had led here, to a man standing in a corridor at 3 in the morning with his whole face open. Margaret Cecilia was followed in the 4th year by James Aldrich, the Aldrich giving me a quantity of feeling that I am not going to describe in any detail, because it remains, some 20 years later, something I cannot entirely account for without losing my composure, and a man of my age and experience ought to have more of it. And in the 6th year by Elspeth Ann, who had her father's eyes and her mother's way of looking at things with them. Directly, clearly, without the small social softening that makes looking polite but less accurate. 3 children are, in the usual way of things, a great deal of work, and the Dunmore of the children's years was a different Dunmore from the Dunmore before them. Noisier, warmer, with the particular human energy of a house that is fully inhabited, and with the quality that I had thought about in the May evening after the wedding, the fires throughout quality that Callum had been too careful to allow himself before, and was now, increasingly, simply the condition of the place. He was a better father than he had expected to be. This surprised him. I know it surprised him because he told me, in one of the honest conversations that had become, over the years, the characteristic register of our friendship, that he had been genuinely uncertain whether the habits of coldness he had learned from his own father would reproduce themselves. That he had watched himself in the first months of Margaret's life with the vigilant attention of someone monitoring a system for faults, alert to any sign that the old patterns were asserting themselves. They were not. He was not his father. He was warmer than he had known he was, more patient, more willing to be undignified in the particular ways that small children require of you on the floor at their level, making the sounds they want. And this willingness surprised him and pleased him and was, I thought, one of the clearest signs of what she had done to him, or with him, or alongside him. The thawing that had begun in October with a letter about music and pretense and which had not stopped. She had not changed him. That is the accurate account, and she would want me to give it accurately. She had not changed him. She had simply been present while he discovered the parts of himself that had been there all along under the armor, waiting for the conditions in which it was safe to exist. The warmth was his. The humor, dry, infrequent, the more valued for it, was his. The deep reliability, the capacity for loyalty so steady it functioned less like a quality and more like a structure, the bone-deep honesty that she had noted in the hall in October, his. All of it his. She had simply been the conditions. The warmth at the base of the wall, the fire in the room, the music that found its way into the place where the door was not quite closed. She would not have put it this way. She would have said, "We worked at it." And this is also true. They worked at it with the 2 kinds of intelligence they each had, his systematic, patient, thorough. Hers attentive, honest, and extraordinarily accurate, and the working was what made it good, not the ease. The ease came later after the work in the way that ease usually comes, earned, built, and therefore solid. The Dowager lived to see Margaret's 2nd birthday. She had been well in the way of a woman who was constitutionally suited to old age. Not declining, but settling, becoming more and more precisely herself. The edges of her sharpened rather than softened by the years, until at 73 she was the most precisely Cecilia that she had ever been. She attended Margaret's 1st birthday with the full force of her personality and her particular embroidery and her dry, warm commentary on the proceedings. And she held Margaret with the practiced ease of a woman who has been holding children for 50 years and knows what she is about. And she said, looking at the child, "She has his eyes and her directness. She will be formidable." She died in the February, quietly, in the way she had arranged all the important things, without unnecessary drama, at the right time in the chair by the morning room fire, with her embroidery in her lap. The doctor said it was her heart and was swift, and she had not suffered. I heard about it from Callum, who wrote to me in Edinburgh, a letter of 3 sentences. That she was gone, that she had been peaceful, that he was well and Isadora was well, and Margaret was too young to understand it, but had been told. I came down to Dunmore. He met me in the hall. He was composed. He was always composed. It was the most consistent thing about him. But the composure now had a different quality than the composure of before. Not the armor composure, the composure that held everything in at the cost of everything, but the composure of a man who has been supported enough to hold difficult things without needing to be defended against them. She was glad at the end, he said. She told Isadora she had done the important things. She had, I said. He nodded. We went to the library. Isadora came in, after a time, and sat with us, and the 3 of us were quiet in the way that old friends are quiet together when a 4th has recently left, holding the shape of the absence, and also, gradually, the shape of the presence as it remains after the fact, in the specific thing she had set in motion, and that went on existing after her. She had done the most important thing. She had found the right letter in 87 applications, and she had bet 3 months of careful, patient, loving maneuvering on the accuracy of her own reading of 2 people who did not yet know each other. And she had been right, and the rightness had produced all of this. The drawing room, the children, the warm fires, the music room in use in the evenings, the marriage that had the quality of a correct sum, adding up to exactly what it ought. She had been right, as she generally was. The middle years are the years I look back on now with the particular quality of gladness that is available only at a distance. The gladness of seeing something whole, from the far end, all of it clear in a way that the middle of it never is while you are in it. I was at Dunmore a great deal in those years. I have no family of my own. I made my peace with this some time ago, and have not found it the loss that people who have family expect it to be, or not only a loss. There are compensations to the independent life that are real and not nothing, and so Dunmore became, in the way of these things, the house that I returned to most naturally, the house where I was most at ease, the house where there were people who knew me with the fullness that comes from years and from honesty and from having been through the important things together. They knew me well by the middle years, better than I perhaps knew myself, which was occasionally useful and occasionally uncomfortable, and usually both. Isadora in particular had a way of saying accurate things about me that I had not said about myself, and that I required some time to adjust to. This was not unkindness. She was never unkind. But it was the directness that did not step around the true thing for the sake of comfort, and it was applied to me with the same even-handedness she applied to all things, which is to say without any special dispensation for our long friendship, and without any softening that she would not have thought was honest. I found, over the years, that I was grateful for it. We became, the three of us, Callum and Isadora and I, a particular kind of friendship that I do not think is common, and that I have never been able to describe with full accuracy, because the full description requires accounting for all three sides of the triangle, and I only have full access to one. What I can say is that it was among the better things in my life. The conversations at Dunmore, in the evenings after supper when the children were in bed and the fire was good, and we had the time to talk properly about whatever was worth talking about, those conversations were, and I say this without false modesty, among the finest conversations of my long experience of conversation. She was precise and honest, and her intelligence was the kind that makes things clear rather than complicated. He was systematic and serious and periodically arrived at the exact, unexpected angle on a thing that is the sign of a genuinely original mind. And I contributed what I contributed, which I hope was useful, but which they would be more reliable judges of than I am. The estate continued its development through the middle years. The drainage improvements from the second year expanded into a general review of the northern pastures that had been on Callum's agenda since his father's time, and that had been complicated always by the cost and the organization required. She organized it. Over 3 years, with the steady, unhurried precision that was her mode, she developed the scheme, managed the correspondence with the engineers, oversaw the contracting, and kept Callum apprised of the progress and the problems in the clear, factual way that he valued, and that made the necessary decisions easy to make because they arrived already organized, with the relevant information presented and the options identified. The northern drainage scheme was finished in the 8th year. It added, over the following decade, a measurable improvement to the yield of the northern pastures. Callum calculated this in the 12th year with the careful precision he brought to figures and showed me and said, "Her project." "I thought it was the estate's project," I said. "She saw the scheme in the 3rd year," he said. "I had been looking at the same problem for 11 years and had not found the approach. She found it." A pause. "She finds things." "She does," I said. He looked at the figures with the particular satisfaction of a man whose accounts are correct, and whose wife is the reason they are correct, and said nothing further, because it did not require anything further. The music room was the room I thought about most, in later years, as the symbol of the change. It sounds like a small thing, a room in a large house, a pianoforte, the habit of an evening, but I had known Dunmore before, in the years when Callum was the sole person in the castle, and the castle had the quality of a house that has been lived in by obligation rather than by choice, and I knew what it had been and I knew what it became. And the music room, with the fire lit in the evenings and the sound of the pianoforte coming from it and the two of them in the after-supper quiet, the children asleep. The estate managed, the day done. The music room was, for me, the room that most clearly showed the distance between what the place had been and what it had become. He never, in 30 years, quite lost the quality of formal attention when she played. He sat and he listened with the full, unmanaged attention that had been visible since the harpsichord night in October. And she played in the evenings, with the ease of someone doing a thing they love in the presence of someone they trust. And the room held it, and the castle held it, and the estate held it, and all of it was a great deal warmer than before. Margaret grew up to be, as the Dowager had said, formidable. She had her father's eyes, as the Dowager had noted, and her mother's directness, and a great deal of patience underneath the directness. The patience of a woman who has decided that the thing worth doing is worth doing properly, and is prepared to wait for the right conditions and will know them when they arrive. She was not, I should say, a person who required engineering from her grandmother when she came to her own making of a life. She was, in this as in all things, perfectly capable of engineering her own situation, and she did so with an efficiency that would have gratified the Dowager enormously, and that I observed with the admiration of a man watching the work of 30 years bear its intended fruit. James Aldrich became a lawyer, which surprised no one who had observed him at 12, when he had already developed the capacity for sustained argument that was his characteristic mode, applied at 12 to questions of whether bedtime was a rational institution, and applied at 30 to the Scots law of heritable property, with equal energy and slightly better outcomes. He had his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, and neither of them was particularly surprised by either characteristic, and both of them were, in the quiet, sustained way of parents who have watched someone become what they were always going to become, enormously pleased by him. Elspeth Ann went to Edinburgh and painted, which was the surprise of the three, and which delighted Isidora in a manner that was unusual for her, genuine, unguarded delight, the kind that is not performed or managed but simply happens in the presence of the right thing. Callum looked at Elspeth's work with the careful, systematic attention he brought to all things worth attending to, and said, "She is serious," which from him was as close to astonishment as he came. The years went on, and the estate went on, and the children went out into the world and came back for the important occasions, Christmas at Dunmore, which had become, in the children's generation, a thoroughly inhabited event. And I went on coming to Dunmore as I had always come to Dunmore, with the ease of long habit and the warmth of long friendship, and the knowledge that the house I was coming to was one of the good ones. I am at present 68 years old, which is an age I did not expect to reach and which I find, now that I have reached it, surprisingly comfortable. I have more room in my days than I had at 40, and less capacity for late evenings than I had at 30, and more understanding of the things that matter than I had at either, which is perhaps the compensation. Callum is 62. He is grayer than he was, and the Highland Duke formidability has, if anything, increased with age rather than softened, though the people who know him, which now includes a great many tenants and a great many neighbors and 3 grown children who have, none of them any awe of him whatsoever, which gives me a quality of private pleasure that I would not easily explain. Those people know what is underneath it. Isidora is 56. She is exactly the same as she was in October of the year they met, which is itself an extraordinary thing. The same directness, the same honest look, the same brisk, warm, accurate competence, the same quality of being entirely herself in whatever room she walks into. 30 years have changed the surface things, as they change all surface things, and have not touched anything underneath. She is still the woman who wrote the remarkable letter. She has always been. They are, at 62 and 56, still the couple I watch with the same interest I watched them with at Dunmore in October when I first understood what was happening. Old friends do not lose the capacity to interest you when they are genuinely interesting. And they are genuinely interesting, separately and together, and the together has not dimmed with familiarity, but has the quality of things that improve with use. More comfortable, more easy, more certain of themselves. I was at Dunmore last autumn, October, which always has a particular resonance at Dunmore, for those of us who remember the first October, and we were in the East Garden in the afternoon, the 3 of us, walking as we had walked 100 times in 30 years, and Isidora said something about the drainage at the northern edge of the kitchen garden that required attention before the spring, and Callum listened with the full attention and said what he thought about it. And she noted what he said and said what she thought in return, and the conversation continued in the quiet, specific, practical register of 2 people who have been running a thing together for 30 years and know it very well. And then she said something else, not about the garden, not about the drainage, a small thing that was just for him, in the particular register they had developed over the years, which I will not repeat because it was not for me, And he looked at her with the same look he had given her at the church in May, 30 years ago. The plain, undefended look of a man in the presence of the thing he wants most. And she smiled, the real one, brief and clear and entirely real. I looked at the sky, and at the Dunmore country, and at the kitchen garden wall that she had noticed in November 30 years ago and that had been properly repaired in December of the same year and had held solidly ever since. And I thought the Dowager was right. She was right about all of it, from the letter to the arrival, to the harpsichord, to the culvert, to Edinburgh, to the deadline, to the garden, to the ring. She was right about the woman, and right about the man, and right about the year it would take, and right about the result, which is still this, 30 years on. The two of them in the East Garden, practical and particular and entirely at ease, and the estate sound, and the children grown, and the whole long life of the place warm in a way that cold stone eventually becomes, when someone lights enough fires and keeps them lit long enough. She chose well. She always chose well. And the letter was, as she said, remarkable. I want to go back, now that I have arrived at the far end of the story, and give proper account of some of the things I moved through quickly in the telling. The years are, as I have described them, the long view, the right shape for understanding the whole. But there are scenes I have been inexact about, moments I have summarized that deserve more than summary, and I want to give them their due now, partly because they deserve it, and partly because the people who made them deserve it, and partly because I am 68 and I want the record to be complete. November at Dunmore, properly told. There was a Saturday in November, the 9th, I believe, or the 11th. November had a reliable quality of cold and sameness that made specific dates difficult to locate after the fact, when the three of us, Callum, Isadora, and I, were in the library at the same time by coincidence rather than arrangement. He was at the desk with the estate accounts, which he attacked on Saturday mornings with the methodical intensity he brought to all numerical work. I was in the chair by the fire with a slim volume of historical essays I had brought from Edinburgh. She came in to return a book she had borrowed from the Dowager, a collection of garden writing, pressed plants between the pages, which had come from the Dunmore shelves some years before and which she had finished, and was replacing with the care she gave to borrowed things. She replaced the book. She ran her eye along the shelf, with the look of someone who is reading spines in the way that people read spines in good libraries, not looking for a particular title, but allowing the particular titles to speak until one speaks more specifically. She pulled out a volume, looked at the cover, put it back. Pulled another, read a page standing at the shelf, put it back. Was considering a third when Callum said, without looking up from the accounts, "The Hume is better." She looked at the shelf, then at him. He was still looking at the accounts. "The Enquiry," she said. "The History," he said. "Third shelf left side, fourth from the end." She found it. She looked at the spine. She looked at him again with the slight narrowing that meant she was recalibrating, the expression I had seen her give to things that were not what she had expected them to be, and that she was updating accordingly. "You read history," she said. "I read whatever is worth reading," he said. "The Hume is worth reading." "I thought you read estate management and parliamentary reports," she said, with the even, observational quality that meant she was not being cutting but simply accurate. "I read those also," he said. He did look up then briefly with a direct look. The assumption was uncharitable. "It was based on evidence," she said without apology. "You have not, as far as I have observed, read anything in this room that was not related to the running of it." "I have read a great deal in this room," he said, when the room was empty. A pause. "Oh," she said. She took the Hume to the chair on the other side of the fire from mine, and sat and read, and he returned to the accounts. And I looked at my historical essays without reading much of them, and the fire was warm, and the room was entirely comfortable, and no one said anything for a considerable time, and the considerable time had the quality of three people who are entirely at ease in the same space, which is itself a thing worth noting. An hour later she looked up from the Hume and said, to neither of us in particular, "He is making an argument about habit, and about whether the argument for habit is compatible with the argument for reason. And I think the problem is that he wants them to be compatible because the alternative is that most of what people do is habitual and therefore neither rational nor moral. And this is too alarming to fully follow where it goes." Callum put down his pen. "He follows it some of the way," he said, "not the full distance." Because the full distance is inconvenient, she said. Because the full distance makes human beings sound very much like very sophisticated animals, and the 18th century was not prepared to be a very sophisticated animal. She looked at him over the Hume. And we are. We have somewhat more evidence for it, he said. Whether that makes us more or less prepared to contemplate it is a separate question. It makes me more prepared, she said. It makes the specific things that human beings do when they are being decent to each other more remarkable, not less. If it is not required and we do it anyway, it is more impressive than if it is simply our nature. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely thinking rather than organizing. That is a better argument than Hume makes, he said. He does not make it because he does not like where it goes, she said. Virtue as radical choice rather than rational nature is more demanding. It requires more of people. He was a comfortable man, Callum said, with the slight, dry quality that was as close as he came to humor in those days. Comfortable men do not write arguments that demand more. She almost smiled, returned to the Hume. I returned to my essays. He returned to the accounts and worked steadily for another hour, and at the end of it he said, without preamble, the argument on page 243. He weakens it deliberately. She turned to page 243 without question and read it. He waited. She finished and looked up. Yes, she said, he does. Why? Because the strong version of the argument requires God to be dispensable, she said, and he was not prepared to dispense with God publicly. He had enemies. He had a great many enemies, Callum agreed. As does anyone who makes the strong arguments, she said. The strong arguments are inconvenient. Do you find them inconvenient? He asked, directly with genuine curiosity. Often, she said. I find them more honest than the weak versions, however. Yes, he said. So do I. And then he returned to the accounts, and she returned to the Hume, and I sat with my fire and my essays and the comfortable particular warmth of a room where something has been established. Not the dramatic establishment of the great moments, but the quiet establishment of the ordinary ones. The discovery that two people, going about their respective business in the same room on a cold November Saturday, can have a genuine conversation about philosophy and mean every word of it. I remember that Saturday as one of the first moments when I thought, with something beyond the cautious optimism I had been permitting myself since October, these two will be exactly all right. The December gathering at the Mariville supper deserves more detail than I gave it. The gathering was, as I have said, a supper of about 20 people, and the professor of ancient history was there, and she spent the 40 minutes with him that resulted in his assessment of her intelligence. What I did not say, because I was not present for it, but which she told me afterward, is what the 40 minutes were actually about, beyond the surface question of Roman drainage. The professor, his name was Galbraith, and he was one of those people whose reputation for boorishness is, upon encounter, entirely deserved and also beside the point. Because alongside the boorishness is a genuine and extensive knowledge that rewards the investment of staying in the conversation past the point where most people leave. The professor, I say, had begun by asking her, in the academic manner, what she knew of the subject. This is a test in academic circles, and it has a particular shape. You begin with a surface question, and you listen to the answer to discover whether you are talking to someone who knows the surface or someone who knows what is underneath it. She answered with what was underneath. She had, it emerged, spent a considerable part of the previous 5 years reading ancient history, because she had had the time and the interest and the books were available, and it was, as she put it to the professor, the subject that most reliably answered the question she found herself most interested in. How do people manage, or fail to manage, the ordinary problems of daily life at scale without the resources we now take for granted? It is a management problem, she told him with the characteristic clarity. The Roman agricultural treatises are management manuals. They are interesting because they are entirely practical. They do not write about farming, they write about how to do farming, and the difference is the difference between describing a thing and understanding how it works. The professor had, at this point in the conversation, the expression of someone who has received an unexpected answer to a test question and is rapidly revising his expectations of the rest of the examination. And Columella, he said, you mentioned his reliability. More reliable than Varro, she said, because he is writing from practice rather than from theory. Varro is a man who has read about farming. Columella is a man who has farmed, or at least sat with people who farm, and asked them what actually happens. The distinction is significant, the professor said. It is the only distinction that matters, she said, when you are trying to understand how something actually worked, rather than how the people writing about it believed it worked. The professor spent the remaining 32 minutes in the kind of sustained, delighted engagement that I had not seen him produce in 3 Edinburgh seasons. And when he finished, and I came alongside him, he said, as I have described, that she was among the most intelligent people he had met in 30 years of Edinburgh dinners. I went and found Callum, as I have described, and told him, and watched the recalculation. What I did not describe is what happened next, which is that he found a reason. I have forgotten what it was. Something about a book, a question someone had asked earlier in the evening, to cross the room and speak to Galbraith directly, and in speaking to him to also speak to her, and the 3 of them had a brief conversation about Columella in which Callum said 2 things. One about the latifundium and one about the management of water, and they were both exact, and both indicated that he had himself read the relevant passage, which Galbraith confirmed, and which she registered with the particular, attentive clarity that meant she was filing something. After the gathering in the carriage back to Charlotte Square, she sat in her corner and I in mine and Callum across from us, and after a time she said, looking at the Edinburgh dark outside the window, "He has read Columella." "He has read a great many things," I said. "Saturday mornings in the library when the room is empty." She looked at her hands. She was, in the carriage, doing the private, inward thinking that was characteristic of her, working something out, reorganizing her picture of the situation against the new evidence. She said nothing further on the subject that evening. But I noticed over the following days that the Saturday morning library scene, the one I described, with the Hume, happened again, and again, with different books and different arguments and the same quality of ease, and that neither of them appeared to find this remarkable, which is itself the most remarkable thing. That they slipped into the Saturday morning library conversations with the naturalness of people returning to something that was already theirs. The theater evening in January requires additional account. I was, as I have said, close enough to hear the conversation in the interval. What I did not say is that the conversation went on longer than the bell, so that when the second half began they were still in the corridor, and she realized it and said, "The bell went," and he said, "Yes," and neither of them moved immediately, and then they went back in and took their seats, and the second half of the play received, I suspect, somewhat less than its intended audience from the 2 of them. I know that Callum watched very little of the second half because I was sitting in front of him and could not see his face, but could see the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man attending to a play, but the stillness of a man thinking about something else with the full force of his attention. After the play, walking to the carriages in the January Edinburgh cold, he fell into step beside her and said, in the low, direct way he said things he had decided to say, "The character in the play, the one whose speech you quoted in the interval." "Yes," she said. "She is right about the difference between being in the room and being seen in it," he said. "But the speech implies that the seeing comes from outside, that someone else does it." She looked at him, "Doesn't it?" "Not entirely," he said. "You can decide to be visible. It is a choice, not only a circumstance." "That is harder than it sounds," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." A pause in the cold Edinburgh street, with the carriages ahead and the people around them and the particular noise of a January city at 10 o'clock. "Have you?" she said. The question was precise, and she knew it was, and she asked it directly because she was a direct woman who asked the true question when it was available to be asked. "I am attempting it," he said. "It is not comfortable." "No," she said, "it isn't." They were quiet for the rest of the walk to the carriages. It was the quiet of 2 people who have said the real things and are giving them room to exist. I kept a charitable distance, as I always did in those days, between what I observed and what I allowed myself to organize into conclusions. The January interview by the carriages in the cold night was the last thing I needed to observe, however, to have all the conclusions I required. He was attempting to be visible to her. He was telling her so. She had understood him. Everything after this, The Dowager's announcement, the morning room, the east garden, the ring, was, from a certain perspective, already done. The difficulty was only what it has always been in such situations, the gap between knowing something and doing it. And he crossed the gap in the way he crossed all gaps, carefully, completely, and in his own time. It was, looking back, perfectly done. Not by me and not by him, and not even entirely by her, though all of us contributed. It was done by the Dowager, first and most, in the choosing of the letter, and in the patience of the year she gave them, and in the deadline that she set, with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and was prepared to do it. I have sometimes wondered, in the long years since, what would have happened if the Dowager had chosen differently, if another of the 87 letters had struck her as the right one, or if Isadora had not written with the particular honesty she brought to the letter, or if the letter had arrived at a different time or in a different arrangement in the pile. I have wondered, in the way that you wonder about the near misses of the things that worked out well, what the alternative would have looked like, and I cannot construct it with any satisfaction. They are two entirely themselves, the two of them, and what they became together is too evidently what they were both always on their way to becoming, for the alternative to seem real. Perhaps this is the trick the happy ending plays on you. It retroactively makes itself feel inevitable, makes the meeting seem necessary, the year seem required, the East Garden seem the only possible garden for the only possible February morning. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps the Dowager, reading the letter in her particular, precise way, was not choosing but recognizing something that was already determined and needed only to be set in motion. She would not have said this. She would have said, I hoped, there is a difference. But then she would have smiled the smile of a woman who chose well, and said nothing further, and returned to her embroidery, and let the 30 years speak for themselves. They do. They speak very well. There are 2 more scenes that require proper telling before I have done the work I set out to do. The first is the evening in January after the assembly rooms that I did not describe fully, the evening when Strathmore danced twice and Callum's face did what it did for 4 unmanaged seconds. I gave you the 4 seconds. I did not give you what came after. After the 4 seconds, as I said, he composed himself with the practiced speed of a man for whom composure is reflex, and the rest of the evening proceeded with complete civility. Strathmore left at 10:30. The Dowager said she was tired and went up. I found myself alone in the drawing-room with Callum and a decanter of claret that had been opened for the evening and was, by this point, mostly remaining. He sat in the chair by the fire. He did not pour himself any more claret. He sat with his hands on the arms of the chair and looked at the fire with the look of a man conducting a sustained and uncomfortable internal argument. I poured myself a glass and waited. He said after a long time, Strathmore is a decent man. He is, I agreed. He is in Edinburgh for the duration of the season. He calls regularly. He does. He is interested in her, he said. This was not a question. He is, I said. He was quiet. The fire moved. Outside the Charlotte Square windows, the January Edinburgh dark was entire and the street was quiet at this hour. Aldrich, he said. He said it with the particular quality that meant he was going to say a thing he had not said before and was not yet certain he intended to say, but was going to say it anyway because the alternative had become intolerable. Yes, I said. I am not in the habit of, he stopped, started again. I have not previously found myself in the position of wanting a specific thing that I have not yet decided to pursue while someone else pursues it. I find I dislike the position. I imagine you do, I said. It is not a situation I have been in before, he said, with the slight constraint of a man who is going to get through this sentence and then not be required to be in it any longer. In 22 years of your acquaintance, I said carefully, I cannot recall observing you in it, not at this level of. Yes, he said, cutting me off, because he did not need me to complete the sentence and preferred it not be completed. Then it is new, I said. What do you intend to do about it? He looked at the fire for a long time. The right thing, he said finally, is to decide. Not to occupy an ambiguous position in which no one, including me, knows what I intend, and in which someone else is in the room doing what I have not done. That is the right thing, I agreed. I have not yet decided, he said. Callum, I said, with the patience of a man who has been watching another man not decide something for 3 months. You have decided. You made the decision in October and you have been arguing with it ever since. He looked at me. The difficulty, I continued before he could respond, is not the decision. The difficulty is the beginning. You do not know how to begin, and you dislike things you do not know how to do. And so you have been not beginning for 11 weeks, and calling it a decision not to decide, which is not what it is. The silence after this was the long kind. He turned back to the fire. She will not wait indefinitely, he said. This was not a complaint. It was the statement of a man who was acknowledging a true thing that bore on the situation. No, I said. She is not a woman who waits indefinitely. She is a woman with good sense and self-respect, and she will make her own situation if her situation is not made for her. I know, he said. And Strathmore is agreeable, I said. I know that too, he said, with a flatness that was not quite suppressed irritation, and that I found privately gratifying in the specific way. One finds privately gratifying the evidence that a stubbornly non-feeling man is, in fact, feeling things. Well then, I said. He said nothing for a while. Then he stood up, with the abrupt, decisive quality of a man who has finished the internal argument and arrived at its conclusion. Good night, Aldrich, he said. Good night, I said. He went to bed. I sat with the fire and the last of the claret and thought, 8 days, roughly, if the Dowager's calculation is the right one. And I thought the Dowager's calculation was, as usual, exactly right. 8 days. The second scene is also January, and it is not mine to tell in the way I have told the others, because I was not present for it. I have it from her, given to me some years later, the 3rd or 4th year of the marriage, a summer evening at Dunmore when the children were young enough to be in bed and old enough to stay there, and we 3 were in the garden with glasses and the long evening light. She told me what she had thought in the days between the morning room on the 26th and the journey home. I have not, until now, given account of it because it seemed too much her private territory to report without permission, and she gave me permission specifically when she told it. You should know this, she said. You were there for all the rest of it. You should have the whole thing. What she thought, she said, in those 8 days was this. That she had been in a great many rooms in her life. Her father's comfortable rooms before the debt, the smaller rooms after, the rooms of the families she had been a companion to in the interim, the rooms of people who had been kind, and the rooms of people who had been not unkind, but not the other thing either. The precise middle distance of people who see you as useful and think of that as a form of warmth. And that in most of those rooms she had been a person who noticed things, and said the relevant ones, and kept the irrelevant ones, and had the satisfaction of being useful, which is a real satisfaction and not nothing, but is not the same as being in a room with someone who is also noticing things, and who is noticing specifically what you are noticing, and who finds it, not simply useful, not simply practical, but genuinely interesting that you see what you see. She had not expected this. She had applied to be a companion to the Dowager because the Dowager's advertisement had indicated the kind of household she preferred, one of genuine quality and genuine demand, one that would require her best rather than her adequate. And she had written the letter as she wrote all letters, as herself, without calculation, because performance in a letter struck her as a poor basis for an arrangement that was going to require you to live with the results. She had expected a good position and interesting work, and an intelligent elderly woman who valued honest service. She had not expected the grandson. She had not, she told me, expected to be in a house where someone was looking at the same wall she was looking at and seeing the same problem with the drainage, and where someone was reading the same pages of Hume and arriving at the same difficulty, and where someone was listening to the music in the evenings with the quality of listening that means the music is getting in rather than simply landing on the surface. I did not know what to do with it, she said, on the summer evening in the Dunmore garden. I had managed without it for long enough that I had stopped knowing it was missing. And then it was suddenly not missing, and I had to adjust to the adjustment. When did you know? I asked. The harpsichord night, she said without hesitation. I knew he was there, I did not look, but I knew. A pause. And then in the morning he told me about the culvert, and that was not the knowing, that was the confirmation. He had been noting what I noted. I had not expected to be noted. You said as much in the morning room, I said. I said it in the morning room because it was still true, she said. It went on being true, He went on noting, and I had to decide what to do about a man who was seeing me, clearly and specifically, and without wanting anything from the seeing except to know what was there. She looked at her glass. People see you for reasons, generally. He was simply attending. And the attending was, I found it very difficult to know what to do with the attending. "What did you do with it?" I said. "I attended in return," she said. It was the only honest response. This is, I think, the account she would give of the whole year, if she were writing it rather than me. Not a story about a scheme or a deadline or an assembly room or a proposal in a garden, but a story about two people who attended to each other, with genuine and mutual accuracy, in the ordinary course of their days, until the attending had become such a complete and thorough fact of both their lives that it was impossible to imagine the alternative, and neither of them wanted to. The scheme was the Dowager's. The love was theirs, it was not the same thing. She would want that on the record. She is, as I have said, a woman who insists on accuracy. The Dowager chose the conditions. Callum and Isadora chose each other, in the East Garden in February, in the pale winter sunlight, in the fully attending way that had been their way since October, and the choice was a real one, and it was theirs. Everything after was simply everything after. The long work, the good years, the fires throughout, the music room in use, the 3 children who came and the lives they made. The East Garden in October 30 years on, with the 2 of them still talking about drainage, and still saying the small things for each other that no one else was meant to hear. I have been very fortunate in my long life to have been close enough to observe all of it. I am glad I did not look away. There is one more October I want to give account of, the most recent one, the one I was in the East Garden for, before I finished this record and put it away. It was the October of last year. I had come down to Dunmore at the end of September, as I generally do, because October at Dunmore is the month I have spent 30 years associating with the beginning of the thing I have been describing, and I find I am unwilling to spend it elsewhere if I can avoid it. I arrived on the 30th of September to find the castle warm and the kitchen garden still producing, and the fires already lit in the rooms that mattered, and Margaret home from Edinburgh for the fortnight with the energetic, purposeful quality she brings to all her visits. Margaret is 30 now, or near enough that the distinction is not worth making. She has her father's eyes, as the Dowager said, that particular pale gray that looks at things directly and does not flinch. She has her mother's manner of making an assessment and delivering it without the softening that makes assessments comfortable but less accurate. She is, in short, their daughter, and the evidence is not subtle. She sat with me at breakfast on the first morning. Her parents were already about the estate, as they always are by 8, and poured herself tea and said, without preamble, "You are writing something." "I am," I said. "About them," she said. It was not a question. "Among others," I said. She looked at me with a particular look. Why? This was the question I had been asking myself for 3 months, since I began the writing. Not why write it, I knew why write it, and the reasons were personal and had to do with the knowledge that the story would not write itself, and that the people in it had been kind enough to let me witness it, and it was the least I could do to get it properly down. But why now, at 68, with the full view from the far end? Because I am old enough to see it whole, I said, and young enough to remember it clearly. That window does not stay open indefinitely. She considered this. You were there for all of it. From October, I said. October of the year she arrived. Your grandmother had just made the announcement about the companion. I came for a shooting fortnight and stayed considerably longer. Because you saw what was happening. Because I saw what might happen, I said, and I found I was very interested in whether it would. She looked at me with the look that was both of theirs and neither of theirs. Her own look, built from the material of them, and then shaped by 30 years of being her own person. It happened, she said. It did, I said. She nodded with the satisfied finality of someone for whom this is self-evident, who has grown up in the household that resulted from it, and has never known the Dunmore before it, and cannot therefore fully apprehend what the difference was. To her, her parents are simply her parents. Their ease together, the fires throughout, the music room in the evenings, the drainage conversations, the small particular things they say to each other that no one else is meant to hear. All of this is simply the condition of her childhood, the way things have always been. I think this is one of the best things about them. that they made conditions for their children so good that those children cannot readily imagine the alternative. But I can. And so this account is, among other things, a record from a man who can. The East Garden walk happened, as I have described it, in the middle of October. It was the same garden, or nearly. The rose standards are the same, and the gravel path, and the wall on the 3 sides and the open 4th. And the light was the light of the same country in October, cool and bright and entirely clear. And the 2 of them walked in it with the same ease they have walked in it every year. The ease of people who have been walking in the same spaces for 30 years and know them in the specific, unhurried way of long familiarity. I walked with them that day, or near them. The East Garden has room for 3, though I generally gave them the courtesy of some distance. I was behind, attending to something I was pretending to attend to on the garden wall, a moss formation that was interesting enough to justify the pretense. And they were ahead, and she was saying the thing about the drainage at the northern edge of the kitchen garden that I have mentioned, and he was listening with his full attention and saying what he thought. And they were doing the thing they have done for 30 years in this garden, and in the estate, and in the library, and in the music room, and over the breakfast table, and in the Edinburgh townhouse on Charlotte Square, attending to each other, and to the specific real particular things of their particular life together, and doing it with the honest, accurate mutual interest that has never been performed and has never diminished. And then she said the small thing that was just for him. And he gave her the look. I know that look. I have seen it 30 times in 30 years, in various rooms and various weathers, always in the same direction, always with the same quality. I saw it first at the Assembly Rooms in December when she came back from dancing with Strathmore, and it was on his face for 4 seconds, and then he caught it. I have seen it at the breakfast table in the Dunmore dining room. I have seen it in the library on Saturday mornings. I have seen it at the church door in May, 30 years ago, with the whole May morning around them. I have seen it in the East Garden every October, though he does not know I see it. It is always the same look. The plain, undefended look of a man in the presence of the thing he wants most, which is the person in front of him, which has been the same person for 30 years. And the wanting has not diminished, and the looking has not diminished, and the particular quality of the look, the full, unmanaged openness of it, the armor entirely down, has not, in 30 years, diminished either. She smiled. The real smile, brief and clear and entirely real. I looked at the moss on the garden wall and found it very interesting. When I went in and she had gone ahead of me to the house, and he was still in the garden, he sometimes walked the East Garden's perimeter once more alone, at the end of the afternoon, the circumspection of an estate man who wants a final look at the thing before the light goes. I came alongside him, and we walked together in the October afternoon, the 2 of us, as we have walked together 100 times in 30 years. He said after a time, "You are writing something." "Margaret told you," I said. "She did," he said. "She said it was about us. I wanted to hear it from you." "It is about the year your grandmother brought Isadora to Dunmore," I said. "And what followed?" He was quiet for a circuit of the garden. "Why," he said. "Because someone should have it down properly," I said. "Because I was there and I remember it, and because your grandmother did a magnificent thing, and the magnificent thing deserves a proper account." He walked for a time. "She was right," he said, simply. In the way he said things he was entirely certain of. "She was," I said. "I was," he stopped. This was unusual. He generally finished things he began. He started again. "I was not easy in those months before the garden." "No," I said. "She was patient," he said. "She was," I said, "and she was honest about the limits of the patience. You were told in the morning room that she preferred directness." "She continues to prefer it," he said, with the dry, warm quality that was the sound of 30 years of knowing someone very well, and finding the most particular things about them also the most satisfying. "I know," I said. We walked the last side of the garden in the October light. "Write it accurately," he said at the gate. "I intend to," I said. He nodded once and walked back to the castle, and I stayed in the garden for a while longer in the fading October afternoon and thought about the beginning of it, and about the woman who chose it into existence, and about what 30 years of a well-begun thing looks like when you have been close enough to watch every year of it from the inside. It looks like this. The two of them in the east garden attending to each other and to the drainage at the kitchen garden wall, and then the small thing, and then the look, and then the smile. It looks like a correct sum, adding up to exactly what it ought. The Dowager Duchess Cecilia Errol chose a letter out of 87. She was right about all of it. The woman in the letter, the man in the castle, the year it would take, the result. She was right, as she generally was. And the letter was, as she said, remarkable. I have tried to be worthy of it in the telling. Whether I have succeeded, I leave to the reader. Aldrich Pemberton, October, Dunmore Castle,